Fuck me, we are away to the races.
All right.
Okay, so Connor Leahy, it's an absolute honour to meet you in real life for the second time, actually, but to interview you in real life. You've been on the show many times now, actually. So we of course interviewed you about alignment and safety, but then you were a co-interviewer with Jeff Hawkins and with Carl Friston. And it's just amazing to actually have all of the expensive video equipment and to do a high quality recording with you. So welcome to MLST.
Well, I'm so glad to be here. What a way we've come.
Well, I was just going to say that. So now Connor is the CEO of Conjecture, and I wouldn't have been able to imagine this a couple of years ago. I mean, you really had the foresight to see how important this technology is. And Walid Sabah recently came on the show and he admitted that he was wrong about large language models.
Respect to him. Respect to my man.
Yeah, I mean, at least he has the humility. And, not to misrepresent him, he still says that there are limitations with semantics and pragmatics, but let's not ignore the success of large language models.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we did that first video, which has been watched 150,000 times now.
Yeah.
And even at the time, people said it was really cool that we were showing both views, the extreme end of both ends. And I think it's fair to say that you've come out on top on that particular
Well.
Yeah.
Many such cases.
Yeah, well, the thing was, I was convinced that you were fooled by randomness because the first version of GPT-3, to me, it was obvious that it was just kind of pattern matching. And there are so many examples you were citing of, no, Tim, wake up. It's really reasoning. It's really doing something interesting here. And there are many different ways of coming at this. I think, do you remember you gave us secret access to the API? So
yeah.
we were using the API through this kind of rubbish interface that I think one of your friends had made or something, or maybe you'd made it. And part of the magic of GPT-3 is the interface and how it's presented to you as well. So there's a bit of that. When it went to DaVinci 2, that was a huge kind of psychological shift for me. I was actually thinking, oh my God. And also I started to trust it in a weird way. And don't get me wrong, a lot of this is still being fooled by randomness. Like I'm kind of cherry picking without realizing, but in many cases, I do trust the output, especially part of it is me learning how to use the model. So when I'm saying, here's some text, summarize it for me, it basically never makes any mistakes. If I'm saying, tell me about this thing that you know about, then it's more likely to hallucinate. I mean, how do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think it's good that you bring up the idea of the interface and how important that is and how to interact with the model. I think one of the fundamental differences when I first saw the model compared to a lot of other people when they first saw the model is that GPT has this terrible interface problem. It still has this problem. It's gotten better, where you're like, okay, you have this great AI system, most powerful AI system ever built, and then you click on the link and you get a white text box, empty text box. Like, what the fuck? What am I supposed to do with this? Like, you type in some stuff, you click a button, and maybe it outputs something that's like sort of interesting, or maybe not, or who knows, whatever. And then you're like, okay. And then you just kind of like don't give it a second thought. And so what was different for me is that, after having worked with these systems way more, and having seen people who are very good at prompting it and spent hours, like hundreds and thousands of hours prompting these models and them showing me what these things could do. And also, me just kind of having worked with the previous generation of models and just drawing a straight line on the curve, being like, okay, well, I saw GPT-2, 100M, and I was pretty familiar with what that could do. And then I saw the straight line of how it just went straight to GPT-3, like just reliably, things that didn't work with smaller model. Some of them started working with larger models. Some of them started working with even larger models. Some of them started working, et cetera, et cetera. So I just kind of extrapolated. It was always obvious that GPT-3 had many problems and there was many ways to improve it. Sometimes people ask me, Connor, ChatGPT came out. Wow, it's so crazy. It's so good. Has this updated your beliefs on AI or something? I'm like, no, it was super predictable. Just draw a line, bro. Just draw a straight line. It's like, the interesting thing about ChatGPT is, in my impression at least, is that it can't really do actually anything that GPT-3 couldn't already do. It just does it really reliably. And it has a better interface because it has the chat interface, which is more natural for humans. But most of the actual tasks that you ask ChatGPT can do, maybe not GPT-3, but DaVinci or DaVinci 2 could do if you're good at prompting.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it wasn't a huge advance in capabilities so much as an advance in interface, and advance in a way to make it more reliable and kind of show the things that you could have already seen if you're already pretty deep into it. So I see like ChatGPT and DaVinci 2 and such as like just like reliability improvements, just engineering, quote unquote.
Yeah, I mean, we've crossed a threshold though, and we'll get into the RLHF in a bit, but I think something like 1 million people used ChatGPT in the first 5 days, which from a product market fit point of view is better than any other tech startup ever.
Yep.
So everyone is signing onto it now, and it's a little bit like when the World Wide Web came out, nobody understood that it was going to change the world until it did.
Yep.
So there's a bit of that. I agree with you that there is a huge technical component to knowing how to prompt it. I've been doing it probably for about 6 months now with DaVinci 2. I use it for absolutely every single component of my life. I always have about 20 tabs open. And the thing is, there are so many domain-specific applications for language models, but I prefer just being in the playground and on OpenAI. I can't even tell you how many things I use it for, like understanding code, writing code. I mean, yesterday I got it to write me a byte pairing code in C#. So I just copied the Python code and I said, translate this into C#. And when there are errors, I just paste the errors in and I say, oh, it's giving me this problem. This is the state of the array. So the hash table has these values in. Can you explain this step by step? Can you fix it? What's the problem? What's the time complexity? It's just unreal.
General intelligence is a great product.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, you can say that, oh, it's just information retrieval. It's just this, it's just that. But, in a way, people have got to wake up that it is a receding horizon. And I have to admit that if you can use it for literally anything, don't get me wrong, there are gaps, but you fill in the gaps, because if it misunderstands something or it does something, I'm trying not to use anthropomorphic language, like understands, we'll talk about that in a minute, but as an extension to my own cognitive apparatus, it's revolutionary.
Yep, I agree. It's an incredibly useful product. You can do incredibly useful things with it. It's reached kind of like a reliability horizon. It's only going to increase. There's like things it can't do. Sure, I could tell you like several. I've tested these models and I know a bunch of things they can't currently do, or they can't at least do it reliably at all. But I think, yeah, it's like obvious these things can do incredibly useful things. These aren't hard-coded capabilities. These are general capabilities it picked up from training data. It can reply to extremely free-form kind of inputs, and like it can be creative and flexible and do all these kind of things. Sure, all these things have limitations, but I mean, my feelings on this. It's just pretty obvious to me that this is just my crazy prediction. The crazy prediction I have for what will happen in the future. People ask me, Connor, okay, you made some good predictions about GPT or whatever. What do you think is going to come next? I'm just like, this will just continue. What happened over the last 2 years is just going to happen again over the next 2 years, and it's going to happen again over the next 2 years after that, and the next 2 years after that. And then at some point, you're just going to have a system that can just do everything, and it's going to do it better than anyone else.
I know, but this is where, because the thing is, I'm trying to be measured here, and while I accept that it's made remarkable progress, especially in syntax, I can think of all of these, limitations, and maybe you disagree with me and we can explore it, but, a lot of people think that syntax and meaning is a Wittgenstein-like language game, for example, and, it's about finding a shared understanding, and things need to be grounded in the real world, and there's the whole implicature and context thing. So I can see lots of examples, good reasons why we might hit a limit quite soon, but you don't think that we will.
I'm making the simpler prediction. My simpler prediction is just, if you don't know anything about the future, predict what has happened so far will happen again, unless you have information otherwise. And I have not seen good reasons to believe that something will dramatically change. Like unless you take in like compute limitations, like we're soon going to hit the just like physical limits of how big we can build computers and how big of training runs we can do. That's still a few years out. Like GPT-4 is still around the horizon, and we can do a GPT 4.5. It's going to get tricky to get to a GPT-5 with current hardware and budgets. If things scale as they have so far. So we're catching up on like investment overhang. Because GPT-3 costs a few $1 million to make. Big companies can spend more than that if they need to. They can spend tens of millions or hundreds of millions, but billions, it's going to get a bit tricky. Trillions, probably not. So no one's going to spend $1 trillion on a model. I'm predicting in the next 5 years, 10 years, who knows? Probably not, but who knows? But billion, maybe, like 100 million, yeah, absolutely. Like I expect that like GPT-4 probably costs 100 million or something in that order of magnitude. And if not, then such models will probably follow soon. So we're going to see a really big increase in that regard. And there will be some amount of diminishing returns, obviously, going from 10 million to 100 million. It doesn't give you a 10x better model at every task, obviously. So there is some amount of diminishing returns in that regard. But there's also a bunch of other progress that we're also making. We're also developing better training data. We're developing better methods of training, better recipes, better applications, better interfaces, better whatever. I think there are bottlenecks there. I know of some that I think other people haven't even realized yet, but they don't seem like fundamental to me. They're not like metaphysical limitations. It's just like, oh, it's just engineering. Like people are just going to run into these bottlenecks and notice, oh, our model is running out of data, or we don't have big enough computers or whatever, and then they're just going to solve that. It's just kind of my prediction. I'm just kind of betting on human ingenuity when you can make money.
Interesting. Yeah, because I think I would characterize you as a kind of universalist in the sense that I think you believe that the algorithm of intelligence should be as simple as possible. It should have a single learning objective. The intelligence should emerge from that. And one indication of a bottleneck is when lots of people say, okay, well, it looks like there's limitations here. So now I'm going to either adopt a hybrid approach, or I'm going to try and introduce complexity into the architecture with new inductive priors. I mean, I was speaking to Sarah Hooker earlier, and she was talking all about you have these noisy atypical data sets. Most of the representational capacity is wasted because, like on the common cruel corpus, like most of it's crap, basically. And she cites fairness problems. So, they're starting to introduce massive amounts of complexity in terms of like how we structure and sample and filter the data. And I know that you folks did that with the Loafer AI models. So do you think that's like a step away from this idea of like, let's just blank slate universal simple learning algorithm?
Not particularly. And I don't know if I would describe myself as any kind of purist in any kind of dimension. The way I think about intelligence is a, kind of a practical observational like descriptor that we put on a wide variety of systems. There's many, many ways you can design these systems. There's many, many ways these systems could be built. They can be all kinds of different kinds of jank. I think it's probably possible you can hard code a AI theoretically if you had 1 million years, just write all down in Prolog, probably. The lookup table probably doesn't work. That takes exponential time. But it seems pretty, what I do believe is that there are algorithms that are quite simple, that if given sufficient compute and data, can produce extremely intelligent systems. And I think these algorithms, I think we're far from having discovered like the most optimal or the most efficient algorithms. I think like neural networks, backprop, transformers are like progress compared to like earlier algorithms we had. But I don't expect this to be the limit whatsoever. I expect it to be like, if aliens from outer space came and showed us their like textbook on AI, it would contain algorithms we've never heard of,
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a little while when we speak about like the rationalist conception of intelligence, but it's the least anthropocentric one, and it's one that doesn't really resemble intelligence in the way that we intuit or we think about things, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I consider human brains to be an intelligence. It is a way you can build an intelligence system to a certain degree. It has certain properties, have certain ups and downsides. Like I remember I was talking to this is a bit of a schizo theory, but like I was talking to someone about like, I don't know what the topic was. We're talking about psychology, I think, and we're talking about like trauma. And then and whenever there's a trauma discussion on the internet, one person thinks everything is trauma, and someone else will come in and say, "Oh, trauma is just a made-up concept." And so where I come on that is that I think actually trauma is a real concept, but only in humans. It's just as an implementation detail of how the brain processes fear, like with the amygdala, which just happens to be true. But you can build an intelligence that just does not have this property. Most other intelligences, there's some properties that most intelligences will share, such as preferring some things over other things. If you don't have that, well, it doesn't really do anything, does it? So, an alien probably has something that looks like fear or like dislike, but it doesn't have to have the concept of trauma. It doesn't have most of our emotions. It doesn't have to have the concept of love. It doesn't have to have the concept of anger. It could, but it doesn't have to. Some of these things are like probably pretty universal, like dislike is probably pretty universal, but like all the like lots and lots of things that others are human, you can build systems that are like that, and there's reasons that evolution built us this way and gave us these various properties, but they're not universal, and there are systems that do not have these.
Yeah. I mean, I just did a show with Chalmers, and we spoke about Nagel's bat, and that's this thought experiment that we can't really understand what it is like to be a bat. Chalmers talks about this subjective experience that you're speaking about almost as being something on the side, which is orthogonal in a different way, like in intelligent systems. And in his view, they have behavior and dynamics and function. And then you have all of this subjective stuff on the side. And it's not entirely clear what we do with that. And maybe that's also one of the features of the rationalist conception in the sense that we almost just explicitly don't care about it. We just kind of like say that's on the side.
Yeah, so fundamentally, I mean, we could waste a lot of time talking about epiphenomenalism and qualia and whatever. I think these things are like amusing to get high with your friends and like pretend you're making intellectual progress, but it's just not really what I fundamentally care about. I'm like practical in the sense where like, sure, it's fun to argue about what qualia does a bat have. Sure, that's, or whispering the word consciousness and or like universal love or whatever. But what I fundamentally care about in intelligence and what I think is practical are questions about how does it work, how does it accomplish goals, how how motivational systems work, how when we build such systems, how can we get them to do things that we want and not do things that we don't want. I'm also very interested in I am interested in practical questions related to this list. For example, like what is pain? Or like what is suffering? And is it like a physical process that can be like, if I give you a blob of matter and I ask you the question, does this blob of matter currently suffer? Is this an objective question or not? This is not obvious to me. And I don't think any philosophy I've read has made good progress on this question. Like some people will say things like, whatever, human brain being tortured, obviously suffering. But then I'm like, okay, but like where in the atoms does that exactly happen? And this, I think, is really relevant and will be even more relevant as, we get better at like if we simulate a human in a computer and we torture the simulation, is that morally bad? Or can you do that? Because it lacks the magic, qualia juice. I usually default to just like, well, it's just like not do that. Just to be careful, like just to be safe, how would you like not do that? And I'm skeptical of like philosophical views that say that that's fine without like a lot of further justification. But ultimately, I'm pragmatic. Like intelligence is a property about the physical world, not some hypothetical thing. It's not some religious concept. It is a real thing that exists in the real world. And the question of how it works and how it can be built and how it can be controlled and implemented and so on are questions of science and engineering, not of metaphysics.
Okay, I mean, I see where you're coming from, and let's both agree that the qualia, the subjective component, that's something that it's anthropomorphic. But could you also argue that goals and function and capability and behavior are kind of anthropomorphic? So like if you build an AI system, it still has an objective function. We might discretize time in a certain way. Is this also us projecting our own kind of way of understanding the world into the model as well?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's anthropomorphic in the same way quantum physics is anthropomorphic, or Newtonian physics might be a better example, but quantum physics works too, where there is no such thing as like gravity or forces. Like reality doesn't work that way. Reality is much weirder than that. And we can, or like objects don't exist really. Like they're just an abstraction that humans use to simplify and compress regularities we see in reality. I think of utility functions or like agents or whatever as similarly as useful abstractions, not truths about reality. Reality is fundamentally some kind of weird, bizarre, dynamical system which has substructures which can be usefully compressed or approximated by talking about agents or optimizes with desires. But fundamentally, yes, you're absolutely correct. There is no ontologically primitive agent. If you zoom down far enough on a human, eventually you just see proteins and just atoms. There's no magic thinking juice. It's all just emergent phenomena. It's all just higher level abstractions over very simple systems.
Okay, well, because you say we could just build AI with Prolog, but it would be too high level and complex. So we say, okay, well, let's have an emergentist framework which is higher resolution, but maybe it's still not high enough resolution.
Well, I don't think the reason you fail at doing it in Prolog is the like high or low level or emergentist or non-emergentist. It's more that we just don't know how to do that. Like, it's just like we just don't have good theories of like learning or like abstractions about the world, about intelligence. Like I expect if, as I said, aliens gave us the textbook from their home planet, it has like the theory of intelligence in it. I expect it, or like, maybe there'll be multiple theories or whatever, but I expect there to be like some that are like pretty simple and like pretty mathematically elegant, where implementing them would be not take many lines of code or like not many lines of Prolog necessarily, but we just don't know how to do that because we don't have such theories. Our like learning theory and like representation theory and such is like very, very primitive compared to like what I expect like, future aliens to have. This doesn't mean we can't develop this theory. I'm just saying it's just currently not the case. I don't think this is a fundamentally like unsolvable problem. And so you can kind of like, so I just expect that, like Prolog is like a not easy to do if you lack theory. But there's other ways of building intelligences that are much easier to do if you lack theory, such as, neural networks.
Mm-hmm.
And just training on data is much, much, much easier, as we can see empirically, even if you don't actually have good theories of learning. Like you don't have to learn VC theory, or like, you don't have to learn like representational theory to get your GPT to train. Just throw data at it, lol. Sure, we had to like figure out backprop, we had to figure out whatever, but there's no like real theory of deep learning. And like all the like current like work on theory of deep learning, which I think is very interesting, is still extremely far from what I would consider like a actual like theory of learning. Like I want a theory where I can like, I define a network architecture or whatever and a data set, and I can learn what I could predict ahead of time. What abstractions will this model learn internally? What algorithms, what circuits will be implemented internally? What will it not learn? What will it learn? And this is without having to run the network. And we are nowhere close to this level of theoretical understanding.
Yeah, let's explore that a little bit, because you said something interesting a while ago, which is that when you look at perplexity, these models are trained to do a trivial objective, right? Well, it might be a BERT type objective or a kind of, a decoder type objective. And you could look at perplexity, or you could look at some of the emergent capabilities. And now we're seeing a bit of a shift away from post hoc analysis and actually trying to white box the system, as you're talking about, and having some kind of dynamic training loop, which is actually looking at things other than headline metrics. And I think you've been doing some interesting kind of thinking in this space as well. I mean, maybe you can sketch that out.
I have been thinking a lot about stuff like this, but just to like make a difference between what I mean when I say white box versus this kind of stuff. So when I say white box, when I talk about like learning theory and such, these are things that I would like wish for, but I don't expect to like happen anytime soon. These would be systems where we understand neural networks so completely that we can like, decompile them into human readable code, edit one specific fact or like one specific algorithm, or like prove a theorem on them. We can like prove this neural network will never say a bad word to a user, and we can like prove this. This is super far from where we are at theoretically, and it's also different from what you're describing, which is like, using different loops or different eval metrics and such to like, move training around. I would still consider these to be mostly black box methods. And like anything that involves backprop is basically black box from my perspective, unless you really know what you're doing. Then I don't think we currently really know what we're doing. So we definitely have seen some, especially in the data engineering dimension, we've seen a lot of people experimenting a lot more with like making specific training data sets that have certain properties, or that like have users interact with a model, and then when like a certain type of bad interaction happens, they will like fine tune it to like prevent that from happening, or they use stuff like RLHF or other methods like this. I think these are all like variously interesting, but I consider them to be as black box as any other for the most part. Like when you train a model using like say RLHF, it like on the surface level it might look more human. It's like you're telling the model to do something the human likes. Human votes up, you tell the model to do that more. Human votes down, you tell the model to do that less. It feels in some sense we have more control, but do you actually know what the model is learning? Do you actually know what's in those gradients? Do you actually? I'm telling you, you don't. If you did, you're some alien from another planet, because currently no one does. So we did an experiment with this conjecture. There's some technical details I'm going to leave out from this experiment, some like gotchas, but the headline of the experiment is we looked at normal GPT models compared to instruct models. We thought these were RLHF models, but OpenAI claims they were not.
It's a great article, by the way. And what's the name of that article?
Mysteries of Mode Collapse.
Yeah, I told Sarah about that earlier, and she was very interested.
It's a very interesting result, and so yeah, there's a little caveat that we thought these were RLHF models, but turns out they were not, at least according to OpenAI.
So are they for all intents and purposes?
I mean, just the method wasn't used. They were instruct fine-tuned, which is a slightly different method. So, and
could you, just for the audience, could you introduce what we mean by this kind of fine-tuning to align with human preferences?
Sure. So, instruct fine-tuning is a very simple method where you basically just create data sets of examples where you have input and a user output, like the user likes or and so on, and you just fine-tune it to follow instructions. So these are like very carefully crafted data sets, and you just fine-tune on those, just like you fine-tune kind of on anything else. There's some details there, but doesn't matter. RLHF is a bit more fancy. This is a method where instead of just training on samples, you have the model generate its own examples, you give it a task and you have it then generate say 2 different outputs, and you have humans, and at first you have humans rank these, and then they say like this one's better than this one, and this one's better than this one, this one's better than this one, and so on. And then as an extra step, you then also train the model to predict what humans like. It predicts will humans like this or not, and then you train your model to optimize the chance that a human will like its outputs using RL rather than fine-tuning. So some technical details there don't really matter. The overall idea is that you're trying to take these pre-trained models, which are kind of just like these big blobs of useful things, and you're trying to tweak them towards more likely or closer to what humans want them to do. First glance, seems like a great idea. Sounds great to me. You tell the model to do things humans like. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Great. Yeah, cool. And so this is pretty tricky to do in practice, but OpenAI seems to have gotten some really great results out of it, with enough labeling, enough fine-tuning, enough tweaking the hyperparameters. You can make really useful models. We don't know exactly what ChatGPT is, but but we do know that the Text DaVinci 3, I think, is an RLHF model, and I've heard from people that's quite good. To each their own. So to go back to the mysteries of mode collapse, we saw this interesting phenomena, which, by the way, does not really happen with the newer models. So I think OpenAI fixed this problem, but we're not sure. It's very confusing. And OpenAI does not share information that freely, unfortunately. We saw this interesting phenomena of mode collapse, which I think is actually not necessarily the most interesting thing we observed. It's a subset of the most interesting thing. So it's a nice post. You can go read if you want. But I think the headline result that I'd like to talk about is there's this phenomena where if you asked a raw GPT model for a random number, and you check the probability of the various digits, it was actually pretty random, which is already kind of weird. But it wasn't perfect. It was it preferred 42 a little more than other ones. But overall, it was a pretty even distribution. But then as you look to the instruct tuned models, I think 70% of the master was concentrated on 2 or 3 numbers.
Yeah.
It had favored numbers. And so why this is interesting to me is surely OpenAI didn't train them to have a favorite number. That wasn't an intentional thing. It wasn't that was something they were attempting to do. What is interesting, so my theory, what I expect happened here is that they were trained for some totally different things. They were trained for instruct training. They were trained for, RLHF, whatever, right? And then in that process, there just happened to be some kind of correlation to some numbers, or some gradients just happen to push things in some certain direction. And that caused this model to suddenly change its distribution rather wildly over things that were never in the intended target. And so this is what happens, this is what I expect will continue to happen, when you train huge black boxes of models by just, throwing these like massive amounts of gradients at them with like, some samples you came up with. Sure, it like probably will be like more polite on average if you give it polite samples, but suddenly maybe it will start really, really liking, I don't know, strawberries more than blueberries if you ask it. And like, maybe that's amusing and maybe that's harmless, but it shows how little we really understand these things. It shows that we really don't know what we're doing when we do these things, and it's very much empirical. And that's like fine if it's just, some text models, just some chatbot or something, it can still cause problems there. But I'm particularly concerned about this as these systems become more powerful and more integrated into society, as these systems become more capable of, performing independent actions, interacting with the environment, writing code, manipulating humans, et cetera, et cetera. Anthropic actually recently released a paper, which I have not yet read, but it looks really good. I skimmed it, but I haven't read it in detail, where they look into how, especially RLHF models, as they become larger and more trained, become very sycophantic in the sense that they will say false things that humans like hearing, and they get, and it's very consistent. It doesn't, like, as models get larger, they not become more truthful, they not become more accurate. They become better at telling humans what they want to hear, which really is no surprise. Like, everyone, I feel like, should have predicted that ahead of time. Like, if you train them to do the things humans like, they will do that, whether or not it's good. Because this concept of good or truthful or such is much more complicated than will humans give me thumbs up or thumbs down.
So I'd like to explore this kind of paradox that in many ways we've nerfed the models by doing the RLHF, and surely we haven't, right? Surely on many of the headline benchmarks, the models are better with RLHF. I agree with you that we have made them more anthropomorphic, and I was fascinated in your mode collapse articles. You were basically saying that before there was this rich creativity to the model, and when you look at the like the probability distribution of the next token, it was almost like like a packet of Maltesers. I mean, you never know what you're going to get, and that actually kind of, if you knew what you were doing, that opened up lots of possibilities. We were just speaking before about how I think folks in your community don't think that AI should be anthropocentric. So we've made it more anthropocentric. Have we nerfed it? Have we brittleized it or made it more robust? It's not clear to me what the answer is.
It depends on what you mean by brittleness or robust. In the sense that, is it less likely to say something the user doesn't like? It's become more robust in that regard. You look at ChatGPT, right? Ask it something terrible, and it's more robust than like Da Vinci was. If you ask Da Vinci to say something terrible, it's quite happy to do so, and it doesn't really care. So the interesting question, there's no universal sense in what is right or wrong. There's no universal correct goal function or incorrect goals. It's all what was the user intending. So in many ways, RLHF can, to some degree, improve, like OpenAI wants their model to be politically correct. It's a goal they wanted to have. And maybe as a result of this, it will become less creative and like less good at like writing great schizophrenic, massive volumes of fiction or whatever. Maybe that's a trade-off they want to make. Is it possible to do both? Probably. Do we know how? I mean, as I say, we don't really have any theories. We're just kind of like, this is a purely empirical science. Like currently, machine learning is more like biology than it is like, like computer science. It's so much of it is just kind of like poking a thing, putting some chemicals in, stirring it around, seeing what happens. And we can like push things in certain directions and such, but it's not as if someone could say, oh, okay, I want my model to now have this property. Like I want ChatGPT, but I want it to also be really creative at writing this type of stories. And then I just like, rewrite it to do that. We don't know how to do that. You can like train on some data and like hope it figures it out. And sometimes that works, but it's very much empirical in this regard. And so the idea of like nerfing or not really depends on what your goals are. If your goals is to have a cool schizophrenic writing aid, then yeah, the RLHF models are probably a bit worse in various ways. If your goal is to have a useful helper bot that doesn't say any naughty words, then RLHF is at least somewhat helpful. It is not a solution to the problem, as Twitter found within like 60 minutes of ChatGPT going live, you can very amusingly, just like find prompts that will make the model totally ignore its tuning there and say bad things or like things it's not supposed to talk about and such, which is very amusing. But again, just shows. Scott Alexander has a great post about this on his blog Astral Codex 10, where he points out, which I very strongly agree with, this idea that, hey, maybe it's bad that the best AI lab in the entire world that tried as hard as they could can't control their AI. Like, whether you agree or disagree that, like, having this kind of like corpo, mealy mouth AI is like good or bad, isn't it kind of disturbing that the best possible lab who put massive amounts of effort into it still failed? Like, the model still will happily, tell you how to cook meth as long as you just like ask it to do it in like Uvu speak or whatever, right? It's like, as long as you like slightly trick it, you like put it a little bit weird, you can still get these models to do all these kind of things that OpenAI worked, which is like one of the best labs in the world, the best scientists in the world, putting millions of dollars into contractors for labeling and, changing things and controlling things. And they still can't get the models to do what they want.
Yeah.
That seems like a problem.
Let's talk a little bit about gatekeeping. Now, there are concentric circles. So the folks in the ethics community, they say we should control these models from the point of view of misinformation, for example, or, they might reinforce biases in society, et cetera, et cetera. And in a way, I didn't like that argument against Galactica. I thought Galactica was a wonderful tool. I've done a PhD. I'm perfectly capable of verifying information myself. I don't trust everything a language model tells me. So I was kind of annoyed at that form of gatekeeping, and I wonder whether you would be too. But in a way, you're a fan of a much bigger form of gatekeeping, which is that these models could potentially form an existential threat, and therefore we should restrict their use, or not necessarily now, but a future iteration of them.
Oh, it's much worse than that. That's my favorite sentence. It's much worse than that. So, like, the whole misinformation thing is, I've talked to many of these misinformation people, and they're earnest people. I want to like make this clear, even if I disagree with some of these people, and like, also maybe politically or so whatever. For the most part, they're very earnest people that are trying to prevent harm and are trying to do what's right, even if you disagree with them. And I, wish that sides could just like see that most of the time each other are trying to actually just do the right thing from their perspective. Mm-hmm. And so, and my reaction when I was talking to a lot of these misinformation people is I was just like, it's so much worse than all you guys think. Like, what are you talking about? They're like, oh, it could generate like some like spam emails. I'm like, man, that would be like harmless. You can do much worse things with these models. Like be a bit creative. Like, what do you think that like a sophisticated like, psyop operation where you can just like clone virtual humans that can become friends and infiltrate communities actively? Like, what do you think that can do? Like, oh my God, like the world isn't ready. I've written essays about this like 3 or 4 years ago. I wrote this big bunch of essays when I was first working with GPT, where I just saw the writing on the wall. I'm like, oh, the internet's going to end. Like you will not be able to understand. You can talk to someone for years of your life. You can become friends with them. They can like hold your hand through the worst parts of your life, and they were a bot the whole time. That's the brave new world we're approaching. If we don't integrate like some kind of like, widely distributed proof of humanity, then that's just what the internet's going to be like. Catfishing on levels, hitherto unknown to man. And I've been like, so it's very funny. I kind of like piss off both sides. I piss off both the like hall monitor type people because I don't care enough about their like political correctness thing. Because I'm like, and I freak out, but and I also not the libertarians also don't like me because I'm also like, oh yeah, this is gonna like be much worse. Like scammers are gonna mind control everybody, and well, not literally, but like, and then I also piss off all of these people combined because I still don't think any of these problems are in the top 5 worst problems that AI are going to cause.
Well, I mean, let's explore this a little bit because it's similar to the argument of paternalism on Instagram. So, you let teenage girls on there and they might be groomed and so on. But in a weird way, it has the opposite effect because it kind of, it's almost like it trains teenage girls to be, to defend themselves and to kind of recognize harmful situations and to put the boundary. I can tell you don't agree with that, but it's a weird form of paternalism and social conservatism, which is actually weird from progressive folks on the left, because they're saying that even now with DaVinci 3, if you have a response on LinkedIn or you get an email, you don't know that it's coming from that person. In all likelihood, it may have been generated by a large language model. That we're in that reality now. And you can draw a line in the sand and you can say, no, I don't want, because it is going to change society. It's already changing society. You can say, I don't like this. I want things to stay as they were. And the same people are saying, oh, our values are changing and the models need to reflect our new values because they see society differently. So that seems like a contradiction to me.
I don't care what other people think. Like, if other people have stupid political opinions, then that's just not my problem. And if people don't understand technology, I think a lot of people... So what I do feel like what has happened is that there's a big, massive ball of problems coming at us. And this whole problem, this whole sphere of problems is so big that it doesn't fit into any one ideological niche cleanly. It doesn't fit into the story of the left. It doesn't fit into the story of the right. It doesn't fit into the story of the libertarians. It doesn't fit into the story of the progressives. It doesn't fit into the story of anyone really, because it's like fundamentally not human. It's like fundamentally just like not the kind of problems we've dealt with in the past. We have to deal with things such as like, human identities not making sense anymore. Humans no longer being the dominant species on the planet. Having brain uploads or like the ability to produce any form of media or any kind of manipulation. The ability to immortality, whatever, right? Like, these are all problems that just fundamentally, it's kind of like how like the ideologies of the Middle Ages had to give way to the ideologies of the Industrial Age. Like, communism didn't make sense in the Middle Age. Like, you could explain it to people and it would make sense because it was dealing with problems that didn't exist. It was dealing with ontologies that didn't exist. It only started making sense when you had radio and telephone and steam engines and labor and capital and such. Like, there wasn't really capital the same way that Marx would describe it in the Middle Age. There was, but like not really, or like democracy, like didn't really make that much sense if you never moved more than a mile out of your hometown and like there was no big nations or something. Like, sure, you can like always like find some weird version of it. But it wasn't a natural fit for the kinds of problems that a medieval peasant would face. Like ideologies like Marxism or fascism or democracy are like, they don't make sense. It only in the industrial and then the modern area where these kind of ideologies started like becoming relevant because they were addressing this brave new world, this new world with new problems, with new fundamental differences. And it's often the case that you have some like progressive reactions to things, you have some like reactionary, like, conservative reactions to these kind of things. But like, if you took the most conservative like person in the West today and you put them back into the Middle Ages, they would be the most radical progressive person that medieval peasant has like ever met in their entire life. They would be like, what? What do you do? Like, what? That's like, they would be completely incomprehensible to them. We would be aliens to them. And we're going through another one of the shifts right now, basically, is that these shifts happen because of technology. These shifts happen because what it means to be human gets redefined. Our economic systems get redefined. Our like abilities to interact with each other get redefined. And we're going through another one of the shifts right now, is that none of the stories that we have been telling ourselves over the last 100 years work in this new regime. Like democracy and like fascism and Marxism are all fundamentally based on humans. Like, none of these stories are built around, okay, what if there's things that aren't humans that also can do everything? Then does democracy make sense if, do the robots get to vote? Do the AIs get to vote? Not? Why not? Like, you can develop versions of democracy that are the democratic ideology that address these problems, but it's not inherent to democracy. These new ideologies have not yet been developed. And we're in this phase of like, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born, and now is the time of monsters. This is where we're currently at. And people are starting to realize this. They're starting to realize that their stories just don't quite work. And everyone's confused. And I expect this to get worse. I expect people to get more and more confused. So you have like people on the left saying like misuse or whatever, and you have people on the right saying whatever the people on the right say, I don't know. And then, but none of this really captures the real problem. The real problems are much weirder than that. They're much worse than that. Like, You can talk about taxes and capitalism and Marxism as much as you want, but if humans just provide no more labor because all of it is done by machines, well then, Marxism doesn't have an answer to that either, and neither does capitalism. None of these systems have an answer to this. So if you really want to talk about ideology, and you really want to talk about how the future is going to go, I don't know how it's going to go. And I don't think anyone currently does. I don't think any of the current stories are going to survive. There has to be some new story. There has to be some new thing. And it's going to have to happen really goddamn quick because technology is not slowing down and things are going really fast.
Does it worry you? Do you think that there is a kind of linear interpolation between where we are now and where we're going? Or do you think it's going to be an extremely bumpy ride?
I think it's going to be extremely bumpy. There's no world I can imagine where the next 5 years aren't extremely crazy. If the next 5 years are really normal, you can throw tomatoes at me and call me and put a little jester's hat on me. But there's no way I can imagine things not being extremely crazy over the next 5 years. And then the 5 years after that are going to be even more crazy. And the 5 years after that are going to be even more crazy than that.
Can you sketch out some examples? I mean, I think you were alluding to one interesting phenomenon a little while ago, which is that some of the people that you interact with in the future might just be AI agents, and they are in some sense indistinguishable from real human beings, and there'll be a massive disruption of the workforce and so on. But can you put a bit of color into that vision just so we know what you're talking about?
I mean, so I don't like doing too much futurism. And the reason I don't like to do futurism is people over-anchor on specific scenarios. So I can give a timeline. And then they'll find one part of the timeline where oh, Connor, actually, that doesn't work because of this reason you didn't know. Therefore, I dismiss all of your arguments. So there's really little for me to gain when I'm okay, here's 10 things. I expect 8 or more of them to probably happen, but I don't know which 8. That's how I think about things. I'm 50% that 8 or more of these, I don't know which ones, turn out to be true. But then, someone will nitpick some of them and then they'll ignore all the ones that do happen and so on. So I can do that. I can give you such worlds that I think are plausible. And also there's also the problem that I think the truly most plausible worlds are too weird to be in the Overton window. There's this concept called future shock levels. And the idea is there's several shock levels a person can be at. It's how comfortable they are with various extreme levels of potential sci-fi futures. And the saying is usually you should never try to explain something to someone who that is more than one above their future shock level. If you explain something to someone that's more than one a level above their future shock level, they'll just become confused, or they'll be scared, or they'll start worshiping you, or they'll yell at you. It becomes impossible to communicate. People can only handle things that are one future shock level above them. So usually it's not productive to talk about what the far future will look like because it just frightens people.
Yeah.
And so I can give you some prediction for next year. I think that's probably not going to be that weird. But if you ask me how things are going to look in 5, 10, 20, 50 years, it's going to be weird.
Yeah, because I was reading this book called The Rationalist Guide to the Galaxy, and it was really, I recommend folks actually read that, talking all about the genesis of Less Wrong and Robin Hanson and Eliezer and Bostrom, and how many of these ideas formed, and we'll go into some of the core beliefs in a minute. But I think it was Eliezer who coined this future shock thing, and I think he has future shock level 4, which is the mind-blowing one that most people wouldn't understand. But talking about long-termism in particular, this is one thing that a lot of people take umbrage with. They say that we're talking about something that sounds like science fiction, so it rests on this idea of existential risk being incredibly important, and the most significant thing for humanity right now is to survive the next 100 years. And the thought experiment sounds like science fiction because it's talking about, for example, the moral value of future simulated lives on another planet because there's so many of them, having more moral valence than, let's say, people starving in Africa now. I mean, what do you think about that?
So if you were hoping for a really spicy defender of long-termism, you got the wrong guy because I am far more practical than that.
Yeah.
I don't think you need any funky long-termist Bostromian like simulation arguments to justify X risk being a problem. I'm like, if you want your kids to grow up, you want to survive this century. That's like as practical as it gets. Look, if I could just get my kids and your kids and, all of our kids to grow up into the next century, I would be really happy about that. And I'm not even confident we're going to get to there. So sure, I can I think there's a lot to be said for long-termism, to be clear. I think there's like a lot of like actually pretty strong philosophical arguments there, but I don't think I think they're also like too clever for their own good. This is a problem that a lot of rationalists thinking have, is they're just too clever for their own good. They'll come up with these massive galaxy brain arguments, which is like add all this complexity and go through all these things and then come up with these like weird, like mostly like not really usable solutions or like ideas or something. And like, yeah, some of them I understand and they make sense. Some of them I also think it's fun. Like it's fun to read Bostrom's papers and just kind of like go along for the ride. I enjoy it. It tickles my brain, and I think he's probably right about many things. There's some things I think he's wrong about. But
what do you think he's wrong about?
Ooh, that's a long talk. That's a long discussion. But about like the moral value of like person moments, and like how to like integrate those over infinite universes. So that's a topic we're not going to talk about now.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, because one of the hallmarks of Bostrom is he has these thought experiments where he makes sort of like, and it's always logically impeccable, like one leap, then one leap, then one leap, each one rests on the one before. Yep. Even with the simulation argument, it's something, I mean, we've spoken about this before, but
Yep. I also totally don't buy that one. I think his argument's actually bad. I actually think that's his worst argument.
Oh, interesting, because my conception was, and maybe I'm wrong, that much of rationalism, maybe not, but certainly long-termism rests on the simulation argument, because it kind of starts with the universe is made of information, we might already be in a simulation, or if not now, in the future, most of the living beings will be simulated human beings.
So I don't know how much would differ from other rationalists in this regard, but like whenever I have this like class, so like I'm not a classic utilitarian by any sense, and I think anyone who is a classic utilitarian is insane because humans can't be utilitarians. It doesn't work. It's too hard. It's too computationally hard. Like this is like what Eliezer talks about in his essay "Dying with Dignity," where he talks about this like phenomena where you talk to rationalists and then they'll like, well, okay, AI can destroy the world, that'll cause infinite suffering, blah, 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 blah. So you must do anything possible. So let's go blow up TSMC.
Yeah.
And then, and I'm just, that's so dumb. Like that is so unimaginably stupid that you would actually consider that a like reasonable plan. And so my diagnosis, which I think is the same as Eliezer's, but I'm not actually sure. I haven't actually talked to him about this. So I'm not sure if he agrees with my like interpretation of his diagnosis of the problem. Like, is that what happens is that utilitarianism is good in theory. It is the moral theory that God should use. If you were a god alien from outer space that has brain the size of Jupiter, you should be a utilitarian because that's obviously the correct way to do things. But you're not. And none of us are. And if you try to approximate this God algorithm of, morality or whatever, then what happens is that in practice, you just galaxy brain yourself into rationalizing whatever stupid shit you were going to do anyways. But now you feel really smug about it,
Well, I mean, because utilitarianism is a strand of consequentialism. Are you a consequentialist?
Okay, you're correct that consequentialism is the way gods should do morality.
So you are, or you are not a consequentialist?
Practically no.
So that's a huge surprise for me. I kind of see consequentialism as being the core framework underpinning the rationalist.
Yeah, so I mean, I would describe myself, I guess, as an aspiring consequentialist. So I wish I was a consequentialist, but I'm not stupid in the sense that if I thought I was a consequentialist, if I thought that I could actually evaluate the consequence of my actions and I act accordingly, that would be stupid because I can't. Obviously not. So for example, if an alien from outer space came out of a UFO, handed me a gun, and said, here, you have to shoot your mother, otherwise I'll blow up the planet, the rational thing is not to be, well, okay, I'm going to go kill my mom. It'll be like, obviously I'm insane right now. Like, you should just be like, okay, obviously I'm crazy. this is not actually happening. I am insane. And so there's like deontology in the sense of having rules over like things you just like don't do by default, even if they look good, is in a sense much more sane for a human, because there are just some things, some scenarios that are so weird you can't evaluate them, so just default to your rule set. So I have a strong deontology in the sense that, like, if an alien asks me to kill my mom, I'm not going to do that. It's not going to happen. And and you can justify this on consequentialist grounds. You can galaxy brain yourself into being like, well, actually, it's optimal for you to not be consequentialist. It's consequentially optimal for you not to be content. I'm like, yeah, sure, fine, okay, cool, but just come on, nerd.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real surprise to me. I mean, I was listening to a Sam Harris podcast recently where he was talking about the FTX thing and effective altruism, and obviously he's a consequentialist, but he was kind of arguing that we are all consequentialists to a degree. There are kind of grades of consequentialism.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think grades consequentialism is a better way to describe it. In the sense that, like, sure, ultimately I care about good outcomes, but I don't think me doing the consequentialist algorithms is actually the right way for me to do that as a human. I'm like reflective in the sense that my real morality doesn't actually have a word, I think, in philosophy. At least I'm aware of it. It's a longer topic. But I'm self-aware in the sense that I'm like, there are scenarios over which I may not reason, so to speak. And so my argument against the simulation argument that Bostrom makes. So Bostrom makes his argument where he makes these three proposals. And well, if this is true and this is true and this isn't true, then we must believe that we're likely in a simulation. I'm like, no, absolutely not. Because for me, there's an illegal step he makes, And the illegal step he makes is reasoning about all universes. And I'm like, no, you can't reason over all universes. That's insane. You can't do that. You can't do a computational operation over a set that large. And if you try to do a computation over a set that large, whatever it outputs is just some shit your priors made up. And if you then take that to believe that it has some metaphysical value, you're just confused. You can do that for fun. You can just if you're aware of what you're doing, you're just making some shit up, then fine. But what I disagree with very strongly, and this is a longer topic about a causality in large universes and so on, is that we're computationally bounded creatures. We cannot reason over sufficiently large objects, and if we do computation on these large objects, whatever comes out of them is determined not by the large object, but by our approximation. It's determined by our priors. It's a rationalization technique. So it just doesn't give it some kind of ontologically privileged status, which I think some rationalists believe. They believe that the simulation argument gets extra credit because it's making an argument about the larger world. But for me, it's no, that is an invalid reasoning. I don't know if any of this makes any sense.
Well, it is, but it kind of feels like we are flitting between describing humans and Connor and describing the universe and its makeup.
Well, it's just important in the sense that Connor knows that he can't answer this question, so he refuses to. Instead of just making some shit up, I refuse to make up an answer. I'm just I don't know. And it's a similar thing with the consequentialist thing. Is that consequentialism? It's the difference between consequentialism and deontology is kind of the difference between P and NP. Is deontology can always be, this is not true, just take it as a metaphor, is metaphorically can always be evaluated in P time. Because you have some rules, you check if the rules apply, and you either do it or you don't. Consequentialism is fundamentally NP hard, is that you have to actually reason about the universe. You have to reason about the consequences. You have to reason about all possible universes in which you could exist and how your effects could affect these various universes. So it fundamentally becomes an NP hard problem. And so if you know that you are not an NP oracle, you can't do NP complete computations, and you are presented with an NP hard problem that gives you some weird fucked up answer, my suggestion is don't do it.
But the reason I find this interesting is it's not just the rationalists, folks in the ethics community as well. They say that engineers are crappy at doing ethics. And the underlying kind of theme here is that our software is buggy. I mean, you've just basically given an example of it. And that's why we need to turn off our emotive gut reactions and we need to do things that are unintuitive to us. And my understanding of all of rationalism is based on this simple idea that even though you think your intuition is to be deontological, you should just put that to one side and say, no, we need to just think about this rationally. We need to think about the consequences.
Yeah, and I mean, this is all fine and dandy in theory, but in practice, this, ends up with people getting into very bad situations very often. Because, sure, some of your instincts are really bad, and you should not listen to them. If your instincts tell you to, hurt people or something because you're angry, don't do that. It's bad. Don't do that. But you have a lot of instincts that are actually really good. So this is, it's a phenomenon that can happen where people have they feel bad about something. They don't have a reason to feel bad about it. They just don't like it. And then sometimes people can be like, well, you're being irrational. You should just like it anyways. And my answer to that is just fuck off. If you feel uncomfortable and you don't like something, then you can just not do it. And that's okay. And you don't have to justify yourself. But it's not an either or. It's both of these are terrible. You lose in both scenarios. Is it your instincts are wrong in all kinds of different scenarios? For example, yes, you should actually donate to the most effective charities. And if you don't do that, I think you're pretty obviously fucking up. Given stated preferences of most people that they want to save lives, et cetera, et cetera. That's an obvious thing. When I donate money, I donate to not to ones that make me feel nice and fuzzy or whatever. I donate to ones that just, save the most lives per dollar. That's just what I do. But it's not but the mistake that rationalists, I think, make sometimes, this is not, to be clear, not all of them.
Yeah, not a monolithic group.
Yes,
yeah.
Not a monolithic group at all. And that sometimes happens is that people think that it gives this type of evidence, this type of thinking is infallible or has privileged ontological status and has some amount of privilege in its ontological status, not infinitely so. It's still an algorithm running on human software. And you can absolutely justify anything to yourself with consequentialism if you're clever enough. And many people who are consequentialists are very clever. So they can justify anything to themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've seen that recently. There was actually a Twitter post I saw, which is that ironically, FTX didn't consider the consequence of the exchange going down in the way it did.
I mean, that guy in one of the interviews, he said he would just bite the bullet on the St. Petersburg paradox, which is just the most galaxy brain fucking shit I've ever heard in my life.
Exactly. But I mean, to sum up this little segment a little bit, it sounds like you're saying if you are in God mode and you actually, because what we're talking about is taking trajectories through an exponential space, and humans are fallible and can't do that. So if we were in God mode, then we would be consequentialists.
Yeah,
and also I think you would agree that the conception of AI from rationalists is a consequential one because it's all about this, basically having a utility function, having maximizing the, let's say, the reward, the discounted reward over that trajectory. So it would be a consequentialist agent.
So there's a lot of subtlety in that issue that usually doesn't get brought up. So you're correct that this is the TLDR version, but there's a lot of subtlety actually in the. So this is the version you'd hear from, I think, also from many rationalists. But this is not the version you would hear if you sat down with Eliezer for a long time. He would give you a much more complex, nuanced version, or he wouldn't because he wouldn't, he wouldn't care to. But hypothetically, if he took the time, he would give you a way more nuanced version of this. So there's there's a great post by Eliezer. I'm trying to remember what it was called. It was something like consistent preferences implies consistent utilities, something like that. I remember. It's the idea that coherence theorems are actually way simpler and more natural than people think they are. So a lot of the ideas of the Miri rationalist type thinking of intelligence comes from coherence theorems and from Dutch booking. So Dutch booking is the idea is that if an agent is incoherent in certain ways, you can extract infinite resources from it. So if an agent, for example, prefers, B to A, and it prefers C to B, and it prefers A to C, and then you can offer it to trade A to B to C to A to B to C to A, etc., infinitely, and you can get infinite money out of it.
Yeah.
So
I think we spoke about this on the first one. Yeah.
So I think you and me would agree that a superintelligence would probably not be like that. It'd probably not have that. Or at least it wouldn't have a computationally approximatable version of this. So this brings us into stuff like logical inductors, where I do actually expect that, for example, humans definitely are like this. Like, you can definitely do this to humans, but it's so tricky in practice, like, that it doesn't work in practice. But like a superintelligence could trick you like this. They could do some super galaxy brain, super complicated scheme that goes through 17,000 intermediate states or whatever that humans just lose track of, and then we could get tricked. So I don't think that humans are like immune to Dutch book, but we're like robust enough against Dutch booking that like mostly other people can't Dutch book us. And that's like fine, because we don't deal with superintelligence. As we deal with other humans, most other humans can't Dutch book us. But like, for example, mentally handicapped people sometimes can be Dutch booked in this way. Like even these very simple ways, like mentally handicapped people often do have these problems. Read a terrible Twitter thread the other day about how mentally handicapped people are targeted by like scams and like automated like robo scams and stuff, and it's just really heartbreaking. It's really, really, really terrible. And so the conception of like these systems as like consequentialist or like whatever is basically found in these coherence theorems. Is if you're in an environment, a competitive environment, where you have to be as smart as possible, there are certain properties you just have to have, because otherwise a smarter thing just destroys you because it's just smarter than you. And the idea, and so consequentialism is kind of like a side effect of that, where you have to have coherent utilities. Like you have to have some things you like in coherent ways. If your utilities are random, then a smarter thing can just Dutch book you. If your preferences are incoherent or they're inconsistent, you can be Dutch booked. If you can be, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you are the only smart thing on the planet, you can do whatever the hell you want. Like, you will not be as efficient as you could be. You would be more efficient if you made yourself more coherent, but you can be coherent if you want. If you're powerful enough, you can buy incoherence. So incoherence always will give up power. It will always make you less effective at what you're trying to do. You'll waste resources you wouldn't have otherwise wasted. You'll be exploitable by other intelligent agents, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're smart or powerful enough, then yeah, it doesn't matter, you know? Or if you're not, there's no hyper predators out there that, you know, will Dutch book you because, you know, you're the only thing in the universe, then yeah, sure, fine, doesn't matter. So I think the argument that like all things being equal, we should expect very powerful and very intelligent systems to be more coherent, to be better probability, you know, to use like something Bayes, you know. I think those are all like pretty fair assumptions to make. I don't expect it will literally be exactly like this. And like even the biggest superintelligence still can't solve NP-hard problems. So it still can't do full consequentialism. Of course not.
Yeah, interesting. I spoke to some folks at Neurips about, you know, how they felt about the rationalist community, and you know, just to be frank, some people think there is a kind of cultic aspect to it.
I mean, there is,
and well, there is. I mean, you said it yourself, but one of the things that comes out even in this conversation is first of all, the average IQ is very high in this community. The amount of technical jargon renders it extremely inaccessible. I mean, just now we've been talking about Dutch booking and, you know, like lots of Bayesian references. And when we're talking about all the Bostrom stuff, it's instrumental convergence and the orthogonality thesis. And it's all very, very intellectual. And every single new piece of jargon depends on the one that came before. So it feels like to even kind of understand what the fuck you're talking about, there's like 14 intellectual leaps that you need to make. And from an outside perspective, it makes the community feel very cliquey. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's a little bit of, you know, friction, shall we say?
Of course. I mean, like, rationalism is like the most autistic community possible. Like, I think people just like don't realize this. Like, what do you think giga autist, you know, high IQ nerds are like if you put them together in a room? This is just what they're like. And I have a lot of problems with these things as well. Like, I don't consider myself a rationalist. And
why not? For the reasons we've been speaking about?
Many of the reasons being also just I just fit in. I'm just not that autistic. Like, I genuinely am just not that autistic. And like, I went to like rationalist workshops, and it was like the worst experience of my life. Everyone was like super nice. You know, no one did anything wrong. Everyone was like super open and trying to help and stuff. But I was just like, oh my God, I want to fucking kill myself. It's just, why is no one normal? Like, can I talk to anyone? And they were all like, no one did anything wrong. It's just, I think a lot of people don't actually have a lot of experience dealing with like actually autistic people, like very autistic people. And so they only meet them online, basically. I think a lot of people don't have much experience dealing with autistic people in real life, or when they do, they don't model them as like neuroatypical. They model them as like, oh, this guy's just an asshole, or he's just kind of weirdo or whatever. They don't really have a good mechanistic model of like how neuroatypical people are different from normal people. And like once I had this model, I was just like, oh, okay, this is just a different culture. It's just, I think there's a lot of nice things about it. It's very blunt. It's very honest. It's very intellectual. People are very genuine in very, endearing ways. There's a lot of things I really, really, truly, truly love about the rationalist movement and the people involved in it. But there's also lots of problems. Also lots of things about them that really annoy the hell out of me. They're, and they can be like very abrasive, and it's very funny when I talk to people about like alignment and like stuff like that. The number one thing that determines whether this is going to be a good conversation or not is whether they have heard of rationalists or not. Because if they had, it's going to be bad. I'm like, oh no, how do I explain this? So I actually don't really like talking about rationalism very much. I don't like talking about Less Wrong very much. Even so, I like these people and I work with a lot of these people. But the problems of existential risk, alignment, AI are completely independent of this. Like this is just the community that happens to have discovered this problem first. This is the community that happens to have focused the most on this problem. I think it's not a coincidence that the blunt, autistic, high IQ community would hyper-focus on very important problems. I think, if AI risk wouldn't be a problem, they would have discovered like, nuclear power or like climate change or whatever, very early on. Like, the rationalists had, so funny story, rationalists actually did exist technically before around World War I. So there is a Polish nobleman named Alfred Krzyzewski, who, after seeing the horrors of World War I, thought that as technology keeps improving, while wisdom's not improving, then the world will end and all humans will be eradicated. So we must focus on producing human rationality in order to prevent this existential catastrophe. This is a real person who really lived. And he actually sat down for like 10 years to like figure out how to like solve all human rationality. God bless his autistic soul. He failed, obviously, but you can see that the idea is not new in this regard.
I know, but there's this interesting paradox. I mean, Sam Harris, a lot of people have gone off him recently because he has, they cite Trump derangement syndrome, and he was very, very paternalistic over the COVID fiasco. And I think he actually gave an example on his show of like, look, here's an example. The meteor is coming towards the planet, and I can see the meteor. Other people can't see the meteor. So you need to listen to what I'm saying. And so there's that. There's this. Well, maybe actually we do need to listen. But then on the other hand, as you were just alluding to, it's possible that there's a kind of tunnel vision or almost pathology going on here, which is weirdly making them not rational.
No, of course. You should never believe an argument on authority alone. And like, obviously so. Like, the whole thing is that the existential risk argument should not be complicated. If you need an authority figure to believe it, I think you're the irrational one. It's a very simple argument. The thinking is not dependent on, oh, Eliezer said it, or Bostrom said it, or Stuart Russell said it, or whatever. Of course, in practice it is, because a lot of people do form their opinions this way. This is why a lot of people try to get, more academics and such to publicly acknowledge the problem. And in practice, this is a lot of how the problem will actually be addressed, because humans like their authority and their status and so on. But really, the arguments aren't that hard. Like, I really just like how, like, ideas such as the orthogonality thesis or termism convergence are, like, seen as these weird, complex philosophical points, because I do not consider them to be complicated at all. I think they would be obvious. Like instrument convergence, just, hey, you need resources to do things, right? Yeah. So if you build a thing that's trying to do things, yeah, it will try to get resources. Yeah. That's the argument. There you go. You've understood post-Roman philosophy. Congratulations. That's it.
Let's talk about alignment. First of all, maybe you should start by sketching out, because you've been on this unbelievable journey since we spoke last time on the podcast. You're now the CEO of Conjecture, and your mission is alignment, although you are doing some other stuff on the side because it's a business. So why don't we start with that? And how hard is alignment?
Well, great questions. Always my favorite topic. So alignment, so my favorite people define the word alignment differently. And I like the definition, which is alignment is the field of study to solve the problem that makes it so that turning on an advanced AI is a good idea rather than a bad idea. I like this very blunt, pragmatic definition. It is everything that needs to be done so that if you click the run button on a superintelligence, a good thing happens and not a bad thing. And so, of course, this leads to more specific things. So, for example, Eliezer has now stopped calling it AI alignment. He now calls it AI not kill everyone-ism. To focus on, it's not about any specific thing or specific direction or vision of how it has to look, or how it's just can we get the things to do anything good at all that is not immediately obviously terribly bad. So the part of the alignment question and the field is, of course, is assumption that by default things will not go well, or at least that there are many systems that if you do run them it would be really bad. So one of the step zero of alignment is kind of just none of us would ever think that every intelligence is naturally good. I think this is a thing everyone will agree with. At least hypothetically, you could always build a bad AGI that does bad things or that harms people or whatever. The next question is, how likely are these to happen in practice? Because surely no one would want to build AI that hurts people, right? So then you have to talk about things such as instrumental convergence, which is just the observation that if you tell a system, a powerful intelligence system, to accomplish a goal, any goal, it very often will require some amount of resources. It will require money or computer or energy or friends or political influence, whatever. Mm-hmm. And then it will try to accomplish that, to acquire those. So, another one of those is potentially self-preservation, is that, if I tell my robot to fetch me coffee, and then I try to turn the robot off, well, the robot will then simply reason, if I'm shut off, I cannot bring you coffee. Therefore, you may not shut me down.
Can I push back on that tiny bit? So yeah, there are two very important concepts in this line of reasoning. So there's the orthogonality thesis, which is this idea that a very intelligent AI might be solely focused on the pursuit of something trivial. And then there's this idea of instrumental convergence, as you're saying. I think there's the famous example of the cauldron, and in the pursuit of filling up the cauldron to precisely the same level, the AI might be worried about being turned off. So, let's kill the person who runs the cauldron room or something like that. And my intuition is that if it were actually intelligent, it wouldn't, would it not realize that, oh, this thing I'm doing is really stupid?
Why do you have sex? It's really stupid.
I mean, it's a good question.
There you go.
Yeah, you've really got me there. Yeah. Do you remember that Jordan Peterson interview with Kathy Newman?
Yeah.
When she was absolutely dumbfounded.
But yeah, so this is what it feels like from the inside to have arbitrary goals. Is that you like things and they feel correct. They feel good because they feel like things you're trying to accomplish. That's just what it feels like from the inside to be an agent who's optimizing for some goals. The orthogonality thesis just says some humans like sex with women, some humans like sex with men. And that's completely orthogonal. And they could also feet or whatever, right? It's we already see this in humans. You just go on a fucking porn website, you see orthogonality in all its glory, It's I'm obviously joking, but it's a good metaphor in the sense that humans already have, not a full orthogonality. There's a lot of things that, no human will actually want, some bizarre thing, whatever. Even so, some very autistic people have some very weird interests, but it's fundamentally, it's trying to separate the idea of the optimization of the intelligence from the goal. Is that a powerful optimizer can do whatever. It's not convergent. It's not all people end up agreeing that, oh, actually women are beautiful and men. No, some people like men and some people like women, and that's just how it is. There's no right or wrong. It's just a preference. And similarly, there is an AI might just have preferences. It might just like things being blue, and then it just wants to paint everything blue. And another AI might want to paint everything green. And those AIs might meet each other, and they might have a philosophical debate for 1 trillion years, but they're never going to agree because, one of them likes green, one of them likes blue. There are things that are less arbitrary. So it's like kind of like what we talked about a little bit about, like there's like Dutch picking and stuff like this. Is that those two AIs, if they want to win, they do have to do a lot of things. They have to gain power. They have to like gather resources. They have to be non-hackable. They have to be consistent. They have to do probability well. They have to do all these things. Those are like non-optional in the sense that they are optional if you're the most powerful. But if you're not, if the green and the blue AGI are fighting each other, they're going to be forced to become more coherent and more powerful and more intelligent, because otherwise the other ones are going to wipe them out.
Okay, but to summarize a little bit, AI alignment is really, really hard because in the cauldron example, we spoke about this last time, so we won't go over it again, but the reward function would just become more and more and more complex because you'd be saying, oh, and you can't do that, and you can't do that, and you can't do that.
Yeah,
right?
So that's one of the...
Exactly, and you were also saying it's a little bit like, we can't really test this. I mean, yeah, we can test it and we can think about it, but it's only really when we launch the thing that we find out. And just like a rocket, it might explode and cause a lot of collateral damage.
Yeah, so those are the core of why it's hard.
Yeah.
So at the core of why it's hard, I think it's really important to make clear that I do not think it's an unsolvable problem. There's nothing in the laws of physics that prevents humans from just building an AGI that does exactly what we want, that builds a beautiful utopia, whatever, and we just click a button and we just lean back and like, okay, we did it, boys. There's no reason we can't do that. The question is just whether we will actually do it, because it's an actually hard problem. So there's many ways in which the problem is hard. Like the ones you just described are 2 great points. The one is just currently we just don't know how to do it even in theory. Like we don't know how to write a reward function or how to write a system that can like do arbitrary complex things, things that are more complicated than what humans can do, but then will still like let itself be shut down or will not harm humans or whatever, because it's a problem with consequentialism again. It's like how do you build a consequentialist that like upholds these like super complicated properties? How do you convey this, especially with neural networks, right? Like God forbid, like no one knows how these things work. Like I give you a RL system, I say, hey, make this RL system please never touch blue objects. And you're like, what? How do I even do that? Like, I can train it on some data, sure, but like, will that like convince it? I don't know. And then there's the rocket problem, as you described, in the sense that if we build a very, 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 very powerful AI system, very, very powerful optimizers, and we get it wrong even once, that might be it.
Okay, but then we get to this thing that the exciting thing about AI as it is now is that it's emergentist, it's learning. But you look at a lot of reinforcement learning systems from DeepMind and so on, there's an incredible amount of reward hacking going on. So it's almost like we're Go-Fi people again when we talk about alignment and we talk about reward shaping and all of this kind of stuff, which seems disappointing. I mean, I did actually speak with Pedro Domingos the other day and he was saying that, don't be silly, Tim, we're not going to have like one utility function or whatever. We're going to have a panoply of functions and we're going to meta learn them. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, in practice, I expect that's what it's going to look like as well. To be clear, when I talk about utility function, I usually mean it as a metaphor. I don't mean there's literally a line of Python code that determines what the thing does. That also runs into something called the pointers problem, which we can talk about in a second. It's probably going to be a learned utility function of some kind. That's kind of what RLHF is. RLHF is a learned utility function in that you have a learner, a reward model, which learns from examples some hypothetical function which we don't know how to write, which includes what humans want GPT output to look like. And then we optimize for that function. And this can run into many problems if there wasn't obvious. The biggest problem there's like 2 big problems with this. The obvious one is just, why the fuck do you expect that thing to learn what you want it to learn? Like you don't know what it learned. It learned something, and maybe it like on distribution looks like what you want, but auto distribution, who knows? As you saw, I talked about like the mode collapse stuff, where you train your model on like some like human preference data, and suddenly it thinks numbers should work differently. Like that's obviously not what you wanted it to do, but it is what it learned. And how would you know? Because our theory and our ability to understand and interpret these neural networks is so terrible. It's not just that we can't understand the policy, we also can't understand the reward function. So we're adding more black boxes now into the system. So if anything, it's gotten worse.
Yeah. So what do we do?
And that is an excellent question. If I had an answer, I would be a very happy man today. The truth of the matter is that I don't know, but I have some guesses. I have some directions of what to go, where to go, and what to do. So it's importantly, again, I think this is a solvable problem. I've talked a lot about like theory. I've talked about like understanding of like constructing things from scratch, or like understanding things or like decompiling neural network stuff. I think these are all promising directions. So if I could like push any prospective viewer into one direction of research, it would be mechanistic interpretability. And this is kind of like a subfield of like interpretability and neural networks that's like focused in particular on like reverse engineering circuits, like really understanding what things do internally, being able to like, re-implement them from scratch or like edit them, like stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, could I drill into that a little bit? So, I mean, I'm interested in interpretability, but we can't even interpret an 8-node neural network or a tiny decision. I mean, like an ensemble of decision trees. It's unintelligible, right? It's beyond our cognitive horizon. And that's why whenever we reason about intelligence, for example, we always look at behavior. Well, in fact, it's the same thing with software testing frameworks now. How do unit tests work? They test behavior. We don't care about what happens. I mean, maybe we do a little bit, but it's always behavior. So how do you get past that limit of our cognitive horizon?
Yeah. So there's a good question, and there's part of that I agree with, and part of that I don't agree with. So Chris Olah, for example, and his group have reverse engineered like basically all of InceptionNet or a large part of the InceptionNet. And you can just look at the filters. You can look exactly, oh, this is a dog detector. And you look at it, it's just a dog. Some of it we don't know. Like 30% of the neurons we're still like, I don't know what to do. And if you remove them, the thing breaks. So obviously they do something. But like there's a significant amount where like, these neurons here form a circle detector. It's like you can directly follow the algorithm. You can even remove the neurons, rewrite them in Python, and then like insert that Python program where those neurons are, and the network keeps working. So.
Okay, but on that, so the same thing. So in intelligence, people have a functionalist conception. So they say, I'm going to take a complex thing, I'm going to reduce it down to functions. So it does planning, it does reasoning, it does perception. And similarly, you can take a neural network and you can take a slice and you can kind of draw a boundary around this. It's, if you look at with the human brain, for example, you've probably seen the schematic of the visual system and V1 and V2 and so on. And that's a really low resolution understanding. It does so much more than that.
Sure. I'm not saying that understanding one circuit is sufficient. Obviously, where you have to push for it is you have to understand the whole thing. Is that you have to, at some point, you have to understand enough about it that you can put bounds on things, that you can put understanding on things. Mm-hmm. Like maybe you can say, okay, I have no freaking clue what happens if it goes out of this distribution. But in this distribution, I can promise it will never output class 100. Something like that. Like that is a useful property. Another important thing.
Well, just on that, because that's very similar with when we talk about reasoning in neural networks. We test for behavior, but we test on a huge amount of examples, and it seems to extrapolate outside of the training support. So we kind of say, okay, well, I believe that this thing's going to work robustly. And is it the same thing as saying, okay, I've developed this framework of understanding, so this circuit does this, and now I believe it will behave in this way all of the time. And is that too much of a jump?
So the difference is empiricism versus theory. Yep. Is like, okay, this, for example, statements are infinite primes is not a statement that is empirical. It is a statement we make because of theoretical grounds. The way we define numbers, we can make a proof that proves that there are infinite primes. So I now have a guarantee about the out-of-distribution behavior of my prime function. I know it will always find more primes. This is an interesting property. Mm-hmm. Now, this is, of course, a very elegant example. This is not how I expect this will work in practice with like neural networks. I don't expect in practice we're going to use like proof checkers on neural networks. It's not how it's going to work in practice. It's going to be like probabilistic. It's going to be like messy. It's going to be like whatever. But I think people are kind of like, some people kind of like give up before even trying. Like, I feel like some people are like, will just like throw their hands up in the air and be like, oh, this is obviously impossible. I'm not even going to try. And I'm like, man, Like, at least give it a shot. Come on. And like every time I try to like understand like these systems, I'm surprised by how much signal you can find, how much you can be like, oh, okay, I can actually understand how that thing's implemented. Or like, oh, okay, I can see what it's doing here. I don't fully understand it, but like, 80% of it, I'm like, okay, it's doing this kind of operation. And where I hope this will lead in the long term also is that we can also then use this kind of knowledge, this understanding of how these systems do things, to build systems that are cleaner. So I think alignment in the most general sense is definitely impossible. If an alien comes out from outer space and hands you a USB drive with AGI.exe, do not run it. Don't matter how much analysis you do on it, no matter how much you scan it for viruses or whatever, don't run it. An alien built it. Who knows what's in that thing? It's like, of course, a smart alien can always trick you. So if you just have a random AGI from somewhere, yeah, I don't think that's alignable. I don't think you can align an arbitrary AI. But the reason I think we can succeed at this problem is we get to build the AI. We get to actually construct things. We get to pick the training data. We get to pick the algorithms. We get to pick the architecture. We get to pick all these different parameters. And I think where I'm most hopeful, like if I envision a good future where we like build a great AI that does what we want it to do, the way I expect it to go is that in the future, well, the way we do like training, the way we do like building is not just lol them out, you take a neural network and throw a bunch of data at it and you just like hope it generalizes, but more like you have like a much finer understanding of like what does it do, what order does it learn it, like you like factor out parts of the network, or you put like do like unit tests on like subparts circuits or whatever, or you like import things that you already like know about, or like I don't know, something like that. But we use some new methods that haven't yet been developed. I don't know what these methods will look like in practice that allow us to build cleaner networks where we can just way more understand, okay, here it's doing this. And I understand this sufficiently theoretically well that I'm not going to be surprised by what happens.
Yeah, I like this idea of building cleaner neural networks. I mean, there was a great video by Grant Sanderson recently where he was talking about some fractal pattern in some area of mathematics, and he kind of visualized it, and it had all of these, like the boundary of chaos. And it seemed actually very regular, but there were like these weird regions of irregularity in it, and you can zoom in on it, and it would just become more and more weird on the boundary. And I think the concept of a cellular automaton is quite a good way to think about this. So that's kind of how we train neural networks. They're emergentists. So we are nudging the thing in a lower level domain, and you get all of this emergent complexity. And yes, we can change the lower level rules to regularize the emergent domain, but there'll still be all of these weird boundaries in all of these regions that we can't possibly test because the space is too large. So like, I guess like this just feels like that's the reason for my skepticism.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. To be clear, if we do this by default, I don't expect this to work. I totally expect that the default methods we will by default use to build these systems will be completely uninterpretable and like way too complicated. And I'll expect we're going to interpret like 80% of them and be like, well, 20% is probably fine, and it's not fine. Like the 20% will contain like all the crazy superintelligence, but it's going to look like noise. I expect if I showed you an AGI from the future and you looked at the weights, like most of it would look like noise to you. You'd be like, I don't know what this does. And then if you like turn it off for some reason, everything breaks. Like, just like change one weight slightly or something. You remove the high frequency noise and suddenly everything stops working. But I don't think this is necessary. I don't think you have to build AGI this way. I think this is a way it can go. But I think there are ways to build these systems where you just avoid these chaotic properties, or you bound them in some way, or you limit their influence on things. You limit the coupling. You limit the whatever. Again, these are methods. I'm making a prediction. I'm making a prediction about a future field of science that basically hasn't even been started yet.
Would you entertain the possibility that the kind of the chaotic nature is somehow a necessary condition for AGI?
So there is a part that is actually necessary, like obviously so, obviously so, which is that any sufficiently intelligent system has to be coupled with the environment, and the environment isn't chaotic.
Yeah.
So obviously a sufficiently intelligent system must be uninterpretable. It has to be. Because if you could interpret it, it would mean you understand more about reality than you actually do. So actually doing interpretability on a very powerful system will not just be understanding the network, it would also be understanding the environment. So if you have an AGI that's interacting with the outside world, you also have to have a really good theory of physics. You have to have a really good theory of optics and sociology and everything it interacts with. If you have a system that interacts with the economy, that like trades the stock market, you have to understand the stock market to understand the system interacting with it, because it's a part of the whole dynamic system.
Right. So, but isn't that the problem? So a lot of, by the way, the rationalists in philosophy, so the different type of rationalists, like Thomas Nagel and Noam Chomsky. We spoke to Chomsky. He said that many things in the world are just beyond our cognitive horizon. He gives the example of the prime number maze, which rats can't solve because rats just don't have the cognitive ability to do that. No one understands economics, right?
Yep.
And Chomsky says that physicists are meter readers, and he cites physics as being almost like this very reductionist view of a much more complex reality. And we just kind of take observables and we create intelligible theories to understand the world that we live in. Yep. So isn't that cognitive horizon going to stop us from building interpretable AI?
If we, in one shot, build systems that are so far beyond our cognitive horizon, we can't understand them, and then we turn them on, we die. Obviously. Can we build systems that are 0.5 or 1.5 cognitive horizons, and we just develop much, much better theories to understand them? Now that's a more interesting question. And if we have a 1.5 system, can we use it to build a 2.5 system? And if we have a 2.5 system, can we use it to build a 5 system? And if we have a 5 system, can it understand a 10 system? I don't have an answer to this question, but it doesn't seem obviously impossible to me. It seems obviously probably possible that if you just get 1000x AGI drops from the sky, you're screwed. You can't understand this thing. You will never understand this thing. We will never, ever understand this thing, and if we turn it on, that's it, and we're game over. But if we build a much more, that's why I'm focusing on this, like, we get to build the AI. This is a common conversation I have with people, where people are like, wow, Connor, why aren't you like happy about like scaling laws? It makes like our like predictable. And I'm like, no, it doesn't at all. We don't know how to predict how smart AIs are. This is a big problem where the alignment problem is hard. Is people sometimes will be like, oh, it's fine. We'll just wait until it's like just below danger and then we'll stop. And I'm like, first of all, lol, imagine corporations just stopping. B, how do you know you're just one step away from the bad thing before it's already too late? How would you know? And sometimes people like, hand wave something's on a scaling loss. I'm like, okay, at which loss does it become super intelligent? Like, please show me the number. Like, no, of course not. That's very silly. It's the ability to predict how powerful a system will be is dependent not only on the agent you're studying, but also on its environment. So you also have to have a very, very strong theory about the environment it's interacting with. And because the environment is the universe, and we don't have super strong predictive theories of the entire universe, we can't predict this kind of stuff. And this is at the core of why I think this is hard. I think if we could all agree to just like, slow the fuck down, let's just like go only like teeny micro steps until we've like developed as much theory as humanly possible, and then we take one more micro step, and then we develop as much theory as humanly possible, and we take one more micro step. Yeah, I think we'd be fine. Probably, maybe not. Maybe one of those micro steps still kills us, but it's like possible. But like currently, we're not even trying. Like currently, we're just like, let's just make as big a steps as possible, as often and as fast as possible, and just see what happens, lol.
Yeah, it's really interesting because in a way you're like a mystery to me, because you are very bullish and accept. I mean, you're worried about the future, but you're very accepting of the technology revolution that's going to happen over the next few years. And I guess like my skepticism is, having just done a show on Searle, for example. I know you don't agree with Searle, but he makes an argument that agency and intentionality are very important, and he actually thinks biology is required. But when I spoke to Pedro Domingos about this, he said, no, Tim, that's ridiculous. It's like, you have a grain of sand and it turns into a pearl, so you have the starting conditions. And I guess you might argue that AI becomes really dangerous when you have this reflexivity. So now it's going to the internet, it can compile code, it can run programs, it can interact, it can improve itself and all the rest of it. So I guess like the question to you is, what do you think are the most dangerous steps? Maybe you don't want to talk about this. You don't want to talk about this, yeah.
If I knew how to build, if I knew how to build a dangerous AGI, I would not tell you.
And presumably you do.
No comment.
Okay. So we haven't really spoken about your journey at Conjecture. Maybe we should do that now.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So Conjecture is the company me and my two co-founders founded earlier this year. We officially really got started going in March. And so we're still pretty young. Conjecture grew a lot out of Eleuther AI, which is, the open source collective. I used to be one of the co-founders for a long time. Great experience there. But ultimately, I started to run into some bottlenecks with Eleuther AI. I love doing work at Eleuther AI. We did a lot of cool projects and such. But at some point, working at Eleuther AI was kind of like, imagine you were herding cats, but the cats also were the smartest people you've ever met and had crippling ADHD. That's what working at Eleuther AI was, which is a lovely experience. But also, if you ever want to get anything done, it was a pain. So turns out at some point, if you want to actually get people to do things, especially boring things, you have to pay them. So around comes Conjecture. So we raised some initial money. So Conjecture is a for-profit company.
Do you mind saying how much?
I think the initial round was like 11 or 12 million.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a pretty big round. And thank you so much to all of our lovely investors who really took a weird bet on us. So it was a really unusual bet, I think, because I'm not sure if our investors, fully buy the alignment thing, but they buy some of it. So
they buy some. So could you expand on that? They buy some of it.
I think they're just not as sure as I am. So I've talked to Nat Friedman, who's our main investor. I've talked to him many times about this topic. And
yeah.
I think we agree on many things. We're not uncertain about other things. I think more and more, I believe the tech world's coming around to my point of view, which is not a surprise.
Interesting. So I recognize Nat Friedman. Are there any other names I would recognize?
Carlson Brothers, Daniel Gross. Those are the biggest investors.
Okay.
So yeah, we're very, very thankful for them taking a risk on us, and it's been a great time so far. All these people, by the way, really wonderful people, really, really smart people. It's been a real pleasure working with them.
Yeah.
So it's very unusual because it's not the usual crowd you'd get alignment funding from, which is because these are not rationalists. These are not rationalists.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe we could explore that, but also we could explore. I mean, you're just a guy. You're very similar to me. You're very honest. You're very technical, and you've been thrust into being the CEO position, basically, of this enterprise.
Yeah.
And I can't even imagine how difficult that must have been.
It's very true in the sense that this is the hardest I've ever worked in my life. This is the hardest job I've ever had. I've never been challenged this much in my life. There's been, people, I remember, it's very funny. Before I started this, I would sometimes see CEOs on Twitter, talking about, they have these, 80-hour work weeks, and I was always like, I always thought they were lying. I always thought CEOs a fake job. Come on, how hard can it really be? It's fine. Well, turns out I can confirm it is actually very hard, and it's very, very challenging. But also, in a sense, I'm at the time of my life, it's just kind of I feel like this is actually the job I was supposed to be doing. It's it was very tough, and I had to learn a lot, and I've changed. I feel like I've lived 2.5 lifetimes over the last year, but
I was going to ask you about that. Now, the weird thing is, you still seem like the same Connor I know and love from before, but how has it changed you?
Oh, it has changed me. It's changed me in many ways. One of the most interesting things we can talk about, I think the biggest emotional shift that it really elicited in me is that I'm much, much more tolerant of tension and failure and chaos and so on. I used to be a lot more concerned about what other people thought about me, and nothing goes wrong. I want people to be, in harmony and not for there to be problems. And I've just become much more tolerant of just no, if you try to do hard things, it's not going to be comfortable. It's going to be a bumpy ride, and the bumps don't stop. and you just have to get used to that. The goal, when it used to be that if there was a bump, I would immediately try to fix the bump. That's immediately attention shifts the bump. How do I solve this? But I'm like, nope, how many bumps are there? Okay, that's not lethal. It's fine. And getting that like level of like emotional, just like acceptance of it, rather than fighting it, I think has been really, really valuable. Also, I'm just like less afraid to say things that might upset other people. I'm less afraid of conflict. I'm less afraid of people disagreeing with me or like getting into fights with me. It's not that I was afraid of that. It was just, it took energy out of me, is how I would describe it. It's just like, I could fight someone and I would do it. But afterwards, I'd feel like tired. I'd be like, ugh. I'd feel like bad. It would take a lot out of me. And now I've gotten much better in that it just doesn't take energy out of me. I'm still not happy about it, but it just, I'll still sleep. I'll go home, I'll have dinner, and I'll sleep. And then the next day I'll work harder and it's just fine. So that's like the biggest emotional difference. I think the biggest thing that I've learned, the biggest thing that I've learned is, it's funny. I think Eliezer is actually the person that said this to me in a different context. Like, there are no adults in the room. This is really hard to explain to people until you've experienced it.
Yeah.
But everything in the entire world is so inefficient. Nothing works. No one knows what they're doing. There is no master plan. Everything is fucking chaos. It's wild. It is unimaginable, like how much you can do as even like just like one person or a small number of people by just actually really trying very hard. It is crazy how inefficient the market is. It is crazy how slow and uncreative big companies are. It is crazy how easy it is to just like go talk to politicians and they will listen to you. It's wild. The amount of influence, the amount of leverage you can gain as an individual or even as a small group of people by just really actually trying and working very hard and being, decently smart and decently charismatic is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things to explore there. I mean, first of all, we could touch on what you just alluded to, which was that even before in Alloy for AI, you had an insane amount of influence well beyond what would be expected for basically a bunch of fairly young folks just kind of playing on their computers at home. But you were, maybe you're in the right place at the right time. You were just on the start of an exciting technology trend. So there's that. I can also speak to this. I mean, I've recently, I've got a startup. I'm the CTO with Keith, who runs MLST. And just being completely honest with you, I came from the corporate world and I was in a sort of, mid-level senior position and everything was great. I was respected. I had, a kind of, because we all want authority and respect and all these good things. Everything was very organized and mature. And stupidly, I thought going into a startup company, I would be somebody. And I think you're kind of pointing to this and you can expand on it. But actually, when you start a company, it's so right when Eliezer said there are no adults in the room. It was like we had all regressed to being children again. We were arguing about absolutely everything. Part of it is about the dynamics of, becoming established and agreeing on sacred cows and lots of friction and so on. It was actually one of the most stressful and miserable experiences of my life. And we finally converged. And it takes a long time to converge and you learn a lot of lessons. But is that a similar experience for you?
So it wasn't quite that much because we already thought ourselves as children. And so when I said there are no adults in the room, I didn't just mean us, I meant in the world. It's like I expected other people to be adults. But I noticed, oh wait, they're also all children. It's like I knew I was a kid. I know my friends were kids. I know we were trying something, we're trying to move from kid to adult. That's like, we knew this is us moving from kid to adult. But then we noticed, wait, where are the adults? Once we started to understand how the world works and how other things work and how people do things and why they don't do things and such. And we're like, oh, interesting. And how much people would tell us that oh, you can't do X. And then why can't we do X? And well, if X was possible, someone would have already done that. And then we're like, well, has someone tried it? And they're like, well, I don't know. Surely someone has. And then we tried and it works because no one has tried. It's just so unbelievably much about what people tell themselves is possible or isn't possible is just completely fake. the market isn't efficient. Like the efficient market hypothesis is just wrong. It's just not true of reality. There's like very small areas where the market is efficient. If you want to like, trade stocks, as individual investors against like a large hedge fund, on average, yes, you're fucked. Sure. Or like, weird, crazy derivatives or whatever. Yeah, you're fucked. Don't do that. Or if you want to be, I don't know, a Hollywood star. Yeah, that's hard. Like, because it's an adversarial environment. Don't try. It's stupid. But so much of reality is so absurdly inefficient.
Mm-hmm.
No one is trying. If I can give one piece of advice to the smart people listening, if you're decently smart and decently creative and you've come up with an idea and you're like, well, this should obviously work. Well, someone else probably already tried it. They probably haven't. Go try it.
Well, the key word is the word obvious, because what you realize, and I think what you're alluding to, is that it might be obvious to you, and surprisingly, it's not obvious to other people.
Yep, very true.
And I had this realization because in the corporate world, there was an incubator, and I actually got to run one of the startups for a year. And all of a sudden, my mindset completely shifted. And my boss at the time, Justin, he said, Tim, we're just dragging ourselves out of the Stone Age. And there's so much software that hasn't been written yet. And exactly as you say, some of the problem is it's just a lack of imagination. It was easy for us to raise money, like surprisingly easy. We didn't raise as much as you did, but we still raised quite a bit of money. And I didn't realize how inefficient these large companies are. I mean, I'm very impressed that OpenAI are churning all of this stuff out, but certainly doing what we're doing. Over at Meta, John Carmack just wrote a note. He just left Meta and he said, I am exasperated. Nothing gets done here. This is a shit show. So many bad decisions, so many committees. And the truth is, as you said, if you're creative and reasonably intelligent, because I don't want the charge of privilege and all the rest of it. There is some privilege. I think we're both privileged and lucky in many ways. But it's actually remarkably easy just to build something, because all you need are the skills to write code.
Yep. Creativity and ability to write code and just actually shipping, actually doing things. It is really crazy. It is, and like you mentioned earlier, how like in Luther AI, I kind of already got lucky and I had this like weird scenario where I suddenly had all this weird leverage. And the question always in the back of my mind was, did I just get lucky? Or did I actually do something impressive? And like, is the world actually inefficient? Because like, why did no one else build Luther AI? It wasn't that hard. It was really fun. There's a lot of other smart people that could have done it, And so now that I've done a startup again, and like, I'm like, oh, wait, no, there's like actually no one, like very few people are trying. And there's like all this like free energy all around. There's all these like opportunities that you just like have to like just do.
Well, let me push on that then, because I would like you, in your own words, to describe what it is you have. From my perspective, because you had an incredible following. I mean, I'm still on the Luther AI Discord. And you would have these community events when you would talk, and loads of people would join, and everybody just listened to what you were saying. You have the incredible oration skills. And you also have something which is quite common in CEOs, which is just like this incredible confidence and vision, and people got on board with it. So is that a fair summation? Do you think that's part of it?
That's definitely part of it. That's something I actually didn't realize for a long time. It's very funny. So I didn't realize that I was relatively charismatic for a long time. I like kind of knew it, but because it's actually very funny why I'm charismatic. Because I am a nerd at heart, right? I am I am more than a bit of an autist at heart, but it's very funny. I never thought of myself as autistic when I was younger. I never got diagnosed when I was as autistic as when I was young, because I was really good at talking. I was really good at it. And the thing is, like, I got so obsessed with like being good at storytelling because I loved it so much. My dad was a fantasy author, and I loved storytelling, and I loved D&D and like telling people things and like convincing. And eventually, as a kid, I don't know, I must have been like 12 or something. I was like, I noticed, man, I really like talking a lot, but like it's kind of a dick move, like to always talk all the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to become the best at talking, so other people want to listen to me, so I can just never shut up. So I like explicitly reasoned this as a kid. I'm like, okay, I'm going to just go practice. I'm going to get really good. So yeah, I just like got really good at it, and I just like, and that was really valuable.
Because we were speaking about this before we hit the record button, and yeah, you're really good at talking, but you're very authentic. So you really passionately believe, because it's obvious, it reeks from every orifice that you really believe in what you're saying, and people really get on board with that. There's a real kind of like buzz around it, because we were saying it before we pressed the record button. I actually said I don't like interviewing CEOs. Actually, I've interviewed a couple of really good ones, so don't let this be a reflection, but there are loads of folks that have reached out to be on the podcast, even like Eric Schmidt, for example, and I didn't reply because I knew it'd be a fucking boring conversation. And the reason for that is I hate fakeness, and in the corporate world in particular, and if you're the CEO, my brother is the CEO of my company, and you know it's like he's an automaton, right? It's a really boring conversation.
Yeah.
So, but you don't have that. You're weird like that.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think so. First of all, thank you, but I think the genesis of that is something different. So I think the ability to like tell stories well and to be charismatic and have like good that kind of stuff is a lot of that is learned. I think what you're describing is, I think one of the traits I more like about myself, or like I'm more like for me, like being good at talking feels like a skill. It's like, oh, you're good at basketball, and I'm like, yeah, thank you, I am good at basketball. Like I played it a lot as a kid, but it doesn't feel like some like unusual thing. I feel like a lot of people could learn this if they just practice. Like some people think I have like a magical ability to be good at talking. I'm like, no, I just practice. Like I just practiced a lot as a kid. And I told stories and I wrote stories and I tried to convince, tell people stories and like entertain them. So a lot of it is practice. But when you describe, and I think you're correct about this, is like this there's another thing as a kid which was different. Again, it's very funny in retrospect if I look back in my teenage me and like how autistic I was and how I didn't realize it. I had this thing where I had terrible insomnia as a kid, where like if I went to bed, it would take like 3 hours until I fall asleep every single night, my whole life. It's gotten better now, but it's very funny because as a teenager, I was like, oh yeah, thinking time. Yeah. So I would go to bed really giddy every night and spend like 3 hours just like thinking really hard about like my life, about what I want to accomplish, about like, my morality, like what does it mean to be a good man? What does it mean to be honest and to do the right thing? And I was obsessed with this. Like how can I do the most good? How can I help the most people? How could I be the best person, et cetera, et cetera. I was obsessed with this question. And I would think about this every single day for like my entire teenage years. And what I really found was, in many sense, is that a lot of things that are holding people back from like doing good things and like doing the things I want to do are actually not so much that they're not smart enough or they're like lacking something. If they're being stupid. And what I mean by that is that so much about what makes me now like more competent than I was when I was like a teenager. Some of that is learning new things, having new information, new skills, whatever, But a huge amount of it is just like unlearning stupid things and like stories we tell ourselves and like stories I told myself and like inhibitions and fears about like being honest. Like with the honesty thing, it's like there's this very common thing where like some people are like, oh, Connor, you're so honest or you're so brave, you say these things. And I'm like, well, okay, yeah, why didn't you do it too? And like, oh no, I can't. I'm like, just do it. And like, no, then these bad things will happen. Like, what bad things? Like, oh, people will not like me or like whatever. And I'm like, man, just do the thing. Just do the thing. And so this like ability to like is like this like beautiful, this is one thing I love about like autistic cultures is like this ability to just see the thing for what it is, just kind of like cut through the social stuff, just like kind of be like focused on what actually matters. And that's what I ultimately care about. It's just like what I got out of this like, autistic obsession, this like almost OCD level obsession of like scrupulosity, of like caring about what is the right thing to do, what should I do, how should I do it. The result was ultimately just like this clearing. Like it wasn't like my brain became more complicated, it became more simple. I'm more like, oh, okay. I don't actually care about all of these things. Like those are like, I don't really care about this, but this is something I truly care about. So I'm just going to like cut away everything else. I'm going to focus on what I actually care about.
Yeah, and that's the tunnel vision is a feature of CEOs. And because what you're talking about, in a sense, you could see it as a negative because you've become entrenched. So you said, I've I've kind of converged. This is the basin I want to be in, and now I'm progressively filtering out everything. So now you were a voracious reader when you were younger as well. So you were in this kind of like knowledge acquisition phase. I mean, you told me before, you read, for example, Society of Mind by Minsky. You've read a lot of stuff. You had loads and loads of book recommendations for me, but now you're a fucking busy guy.
Yep.
You're a busy guy. You've converged, and also maybe you can talk about a lot of people make demands on your time now, and you have to start filtering things out, and you have to deal with a lot of flawed human beings. So how has, in this new regime, how has that changed you?
Absolutely great question. And I think you really hit it on the head in that if there's one regret I have. I wish I would have done more things as a kid because I had more time back then. And, I did. It's I was surprisingly not that clever as a kid. It was I don't know. I feel like I was stupid as a kid. I didn't really read that much. I only really started reading after I was 18. And as a kid, I didn't really read that much. I didn't really do that much. I kind of just thought a lot, I just kind of do thinking really hard, but I didn't really gather evidence about reality. And that definitely held me back for a long time. So I'm now at the point, and what the difference is between now and a year ago is bits of evidence I've collected about reality from actually doing things in the real world. Is that I think for years now, I mean, probably since my early 20s, I've actually been held back. I didn't realize this, but I was held back not by my knowledge or my intelligence. I was academic enough. I was educated enough. I was, verbal enough. But I was held back by not trying things in the real world, not talking to people, not doing business, not building things, not failing, not meeting new people, not traveling, not doing all of this. And so in that regard, it's definitely the case that I don't have time to read tons of books anymore. And that does lose me some things because I did, especially in my later 20s, when I was 25 or something, I spent all day reading every single day, just all day, just nonstop. And that was very helpful. And but I'm now in an overhang. I've read too much. Now I need to gather other kinds of information. And over the last year, I've learned so much from interacting with reality, from meeting people, from going to Brussels and talking to politicians, from building a product, from trying to raise money, from all these kinds of things. So in that regard, I've learned different things. There's different kinds of evidence that I've been able to gather more effectively, and I've gotten better and more effective at gathering evidence. So a word that keeps getting brought up at Conjecture that other people, I think, don't use or use differently than we do is good epistemology.
Yeah.
I think epistemology, so the way, it is not, I'm sure the philosophers will argue with me what the correct definition is, but the way I think about epistemology, having good epistemology, is kind of the ability to come into a new field or a new area where you know nothing about it, and you know how to gain the evidence you need to gain to build the theories you need to build to succeed at what you want to succeed at. Kind of up the meta hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very universal skill. It's a super universal skill. And I think it wasn't obvious to me for a long time that this is a skill you can even practice. It was you can practice a field. You can go into a topic and you can work on it. But it was clear to me that you can practice the skill of getting good at skills. But that's actually obviously true now in retrospect.
Yeah, and I want to tease that apart a little bit. So at first you were saying, and by the way, people like Jan LeCun make the opposite argument. They think that AGI should be mostly observational rather than interactive. But I agree with you that there's only so much you can learn from reading books, because what you're doing is you're reading vicarious experience and having a strong learning signal through interaction. Now, actually, there's a bit of luck because it's the opportunity to do what you're doing. Similarly, anyone who goes out there and makes a startup, even if it fails, you will learn more doing that than reading 1,000 books.
Absolutely agree. Genuinely, one of the number one things I love to see on people's CVs is failed startups.
Yep.
Doesn't matter if they succeed or not. The fact that they tried, they went out and they interacted with reality will give them so many bits of evidence, so many skills, so much knowledge that cannot be gained other ways. It's so impactful.
Yeah, exactly. So you've thrown yourself into the fire and it's changed you.
Yeah, it has. And it really has, but for the better. It feels like I've been sharpened. It feels like I've become more where I was heading, rather than like I'm a different person now. It's like I like to think that like every version of me throughout time, if they could like look forward to me now, they would still recognize me. We would disagree and they'd be confused about some of the things I believe and some of the things I do, but we would recognize each other. We would see that we're still the same person, and I think that's even so, I'm quite different from younger me in many ways, and I have some very different opinions and some very different views in reality than them.
I'd like to talk about your learning rate though. So if for example we discovered over the next 5 years that AGI doesn't happen in the way that you think it does, how much of your identity is tied up in this current kind of journey?
I mean, ideally zero. Like, ultimately, my goal is, the only thing I really care about is to make a good future for mankind, is to make everyone happy. The fundamental thing I care about is that I don't want people to suffer anymore. No one.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it is.
And where does that come from?
You can pick your own orthogonality, orthogonal goals, right? I just really don't like people suffering. I really, really, really don't like it, and I want it to stop, and I'm going to make it stop. And I want things to be nice. I want people to be happy. I see, especially as a kid, this was like, it's very silly. It's very silly, but it's like a very autistic thing. It's like this, like, as a kid, when I was like, I don't know, 8 or 9 or something, I would like, I remember having a newspaper, and I read this newspaper, and I haven't really read a newspaper before, like never really actively. And I read some article, I don't know what it was about, but it was something like pretty boring. It was like, I don't know, it was like a car accident happened, and like someone like got hurt or something. And it just like hit me. I put myself into this scenario, and like, oh, this poor woman, like, oh my God, like she might lose her job, and like she's in pain, and like, oh, she has a small daughter, and like, oh no, what do the daughter think? She's gonna be scared of cars for the rest of her life. Like, oh my God, like it was this very small thing. It was very, very small. But then I noticed if I put just the littlest bit of creativity into like imagining actually the suffering, and then it's just hit me that this was everywhere. There's everything from the smallest things we do every single day. Every heartbreak, every missed opportunity, every miscommunication, every accident, every tragedy. It's just so horrific. It's just the true, like, as a teenager, I had this theory that like every drama can be equally or better rewritten as a horror. I loved horror movies. They was always my favorite. I had this obsession with things that frightened me. And I found that I really quickly got super numb to like monster movies or like aliens or like whatever. It's because it's like, this is a monster, right? It kills you or whatever. Like, but it's like it's not real. It's like kind of fun. It's fun if you have some like crazy, creepy monster that skins the protagonist alive, and like, isn't that kind of like, oh lol, it's like gross. It's like kind of fun. But the one that really got me, like the horror movies that like still stuck with me, were always the ones that are the least abnormal. It was always just like something tragic happened. Just like someone had a terrible life and their parents abused them and they commit suicide. Those are the ones that are really stuck to me because those are real. And this happens to people all the fucking time. And I feel like not wanting that is just obvious. I think everyone wants those things to stop. And I had this weird experience as a kid, is I would like, it was obvious to me like, oh, I have to cure aging. Of course. Because like, look at all these people are getting old and it hurts. They're sad and it's bad and they die. And then when people die, that's sad. So we just have to not do that anymore. And when I would bring this to people, they would look at me like I'm crazy. They'd be like, oh, no, actually aging is good. It gives life meaning. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, what? No, people are sad. Sad is bad. So in a sense, I always was a bit of like, just this like, so this is what I really focused on. Like, AI or like anti-aging or like whatever are all instrumental. All my full identity is I want people to not be sad anymore.
Okay, because two things jump out at me there. First of all, I guess I'm pleased and a little bit surprised just the empathy that you feel at a cellular level. And most people would be surprised by that, because you were just talking about, like, again, not to essentialize rationalists, but you kind of think of them as being slightly autistic and low on empathy. And that's a surprise, because you're very high on empathy.
So I would actually push back against that.
Okay.
I'm going to push back against that. I think actually autistic people, not all of them, but many, I think if you selected for the highest empathy individuals, most of them would be autistic.
Really?
And so the reason I think this is because, so we can talk about autism and my schizo theory for autism for longer. But the reason for this is I think that a lot of things that holds people back from true empathy is exactly these things I was talking about, is that people galaxy brain themselves. They add in all this complexity, these like social roles, these like kids often are very empathetic, but then they're taught they're not supposed to care, or you learn to not care, or things are so horrible, terrible things happen, you learn not to care, or you just follow your social rules. Like in your culture, maybe there's this, your tribe is suffering is bad, but the other tribe, well, they suffer. That's good, actually. So you shouldn't worry about that. And it takes the there's like true, just autistic, just like disregard of social norms and like taking things seriously to like actually see. I remember I talked to someone I know about this, and I talked to them like as a kid. I was obsessed with like empathy and like making the world a better place, and I didn't want people to hurt. And she was like, well, yes, and I see that. I was like, I'm definitely telling you is like, this is what makes you so human. This empathy. I'm like, no. You're very wrong. Empathy is very not human. A very, very, very empathetic creature is an alien. Really, really moral people do not look like charismatic Hollywood star. No, they're weird fucking aliens. They're weird autistic aliens. They get obsessed and they write massive papers about simulated souls in the far future universe and how we can maximize the long-termism. That's what maximum empathy actually looks like. If you actually maximize your utility function for empathy, what you get is people like Bostrom and Eliezer. They look like aliens because it's really weird, and humans are usually not like this.
So this is a fascinating point. First of all, I want to get to that in a second, but would you describe yourself as a transhumanist?
You can describe me that way, but I don't associate with the movement.
Interesting, because it sounds quite similar, but I guess maybe I've been thinking about this the wrong way, but what you're describing, because I had assumed that it was almost like a pathology of the lack of empathy to kind of make up for it in a very technical way. And I would say what you're describing, we were saying earlier about our software is buggy, right? And we need to fix it. And what you're talking about is a very technical form of empathy, which most people can't really feel in the same way.
Yep. If you really want to see if I had to pick the most empathetic man to ever live, it would be Brian Tomasic. He's an author. He wrote a bunch of essays, and they're the weirdest, most inhuman, alien shit you'll ever read in your life. Most people read this and will actually conclude that he might be the most evil man to ever live. For example, he thinks deforestation is good. And the reason he thinks deforestation is good is because it kills lots of animals. And because that's good, because those animals in nature would have suffered. Because they'll be like sick and they'll be eaten and killed. So if we just kill them and like pave over it, there'll be less animals that experience less suffering. And then we can put humans there and they suffer less, or we can have, like some other like pets that are not suffering. You have to be an alien to come up with this. But this is what, dial up all the way of empathy actually looks like. It does not look very human at all. It looks really, really fucking weird.
So the paradox is that a lot of people, we won't say who they are, these are people who have, let's say, sensory empathy, and they don't recognize what you're doing as empathy.
Yep.
They don't understand it.
Yep.
What would you say to them?
It's very different. I think a lot of people who have sensory empathy don't actually take empathy seriously as a concept, is that they're not optimizers. They're not maximizing. They have a proxy. They have a heuristic. They have a feeling. They have a thing, which is associated with that. It is correlated with with empathy, but it's not the maximum. So this is like Brian Tomasic is the example of is like the human equivalent of a paperclip maximizer for empathy. Is like humans would be like, oh, it's so silly. Why would the paperclip maximizer only want paperclips? And like, well, why does Brian Tomasic only want empathy? Why does Brian Tomasic only want to reduce suffering? This is what it looks like. If you have a very intelligent system, if an optimizer, it will go to really weird extremes. Most humans are not optimizers. The state of optimizing of like actually trying your hardest to maximize a goal is actually not how most humans work. A friend of mine had a very cynical take. He said, most humans are like wind-up toys. They optimize for n steps and then they halt. And it doesn't matter where they halt. That's just as far as they go. And they don't even feel the obligation to have to go further than this. It's actually very unnatural for humans to really try to go as many steps as they can go. And that's why when people do try to do this, they can often achieve looks like supernatural amounts of things, because most people don't really try. They don't go for arbitrary amount of steps. They go so many steps. And with empathy, this many steps. Like, okay, my family, yeah, sure. My neighbors, sure, cool. My country, sure. This other country I don't like, okay, let's slow down. That's what n steps of optimization looks like, rather than arbitrary steps. Arbitrary step says, okay, other country, yeah, absolutely. All humans, yeah, absolutely. Animals, yeah, sure. Plants, probably. That's what optimization looks like. Humans exist in a very small regime. And this applies to everything. It applies to our abilities, it applies to our thoughts, our emotions, it applies to everything. Humans are very bounded. And this is one of the things why AI is going to be very different. It's going to look way more like Brian Tomasik than it is going to look like you and me necessarily. It's going to look like systems that take these things and bring them to such extremes and are willing to go so far, because that's how we build them,
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So, I mean, this is moral status. It decays exponentially with time and space. I mean, even the way that we understand causality is very flawed. Like look at road traffic accidents, for example. It's not easy sometimes to assign who's morally accountable. But what are the limits then? Because if you take this to the nth degree, surely you can be fooled by randomness, and you can. It almost becomes pathological. You might do things which are apparently extreme.
As I said, Brian Tomasik thinks we should kill all animals, and I disagree with him on that, but his reasoning is sound. His reasoning is completely sound, given his objectives, given what he believes, and his objective is completely sound. And you say pathological. Yeah, Brian recently stopped writing because he basically had a mental breakdown and said he just can't handle it anymore. He's going to live in a farm alone with his parents and not talk to anyone ever again. So yes, This is a very unnatural and a very non-human state to be in. And, God bless my man, Brian Tomasik, even if I strongly disagree with him. And I think if we implemented his ethics, that would be a moral catastrophe. He actually tried. He actually really tried to do as most good as possible. He really, really, really tried. He has an essay, which is, Can Electrons Suffer? He really tried. That's what really trying looks like. He wanted to reduce suffering, and he went all the way. And he was very mentally ill, obviously. Like, this man obviously you only go that far if you're very ill. Like, you have to be very neurotypical to be capable of this. And obviously, I don't agree. I'm not Brian, and I don't think we should kill all animals. Anyway, I don't think we should, and all the others, some of the things. But clearly, I also think that many other humans are not sufficiently empathetic. So, because for example, if I tell people, hey, I think people should not die, they're like, no, it's normal, it's the correct thing. I'm like, man, you don't even take your empathy seriously. You don't actually take the reduction of empathy seriously. Like, death is bad. People dying is sad. We should just not do that.
I know. I mean, what worries me, because you could use a similar argumentation to justify the actions of the Unabomber, for example, or a similar. You could argue basically, because there's a theme to our conversation, which is that our thinking is anthropomorphic and it's problematic. So we should dehumanize our thinking and be more rational. And then you get to a stage that appears to an external observer like nihilism. Like, for example, I can say, if all humans, I think this is a thought experiment in philosophy, if all humans died in their sleep painlessly tonight, it would kind of reduce the suffering in the world. Therefore, let's do it.
Yep.
That just seems, it's unimaginable to most people.
Yes, it is a completely reasonable argument given the premises. If you accept the premises, it is a reasonable argument. I just don't accept the premises. Lol, I'm not a consequentialist. I'm not a negative utilitarian. Like, if you're a negative utilitarian, then yes, that argument makes perfect sense. I'm not. And I don't claim to be. I have deontological principles. One of my deontological principles is I don't kill all humans. I don't have a justification for that. Like, a sufficiently intelligent alien or Brian or whatever can give me an argument that should convince me to kill all humans. I'm not going to do it. But that is a deontological commitment. That is what I mean. That's what it means to not be a consequentialist. If you are a consequentialist, you have to do these things. You have to be capable of doing these things. And then if you're a consequentialist who is also human, you get people like the Unabomber, who is just dumb. Like, sorry, Ted, but like, his main, other than being cruel and just like, horrific, it was just stupid. Like, if his stated goals were what he described, how did he expect this plan to actually achieve that? Like, Lamau? It's like the pseudo-rationalists who are like, oh, to stop AGI, we should bomb Taiwan. And I'm like, man, even if you did that, what exactly is your thinking that thinks that plan would actually work? Like, are you insane? So there's the part of like, consequentialism can lead you to bad outcomes. And like, I mean, so there's the cheeky answer is that, well, if you did it right, no, it wouldn't. If you were good at consequentialism and there was a bad option, you just wouldn't pick it. Like, obviously so. But then there's the other thing, which is like approximate consequentialism, where if you have a human who's trying to reason consequentially over a space they can't reason over, yes, they're going to make mistakes. And in that process, those mistakes can be like arbitrarily bad from a different perspective.
Awesome. Okay. What else do you want to talk about?
I haven't really talked about conjecture much or what I've worked at all, really.
Tell me more.
I'd love to talk about it more. So it's been a wild ride at conjecture. And we're about 18 people now. We do a lot of interesting things. We're a bit of an unusual company, where, like I've been talking about, at heart, what we want to do is solve the alignment problem, and, create a good future for the mankind, and make things well. But we're also very pragmatic in that research is expensive, and you need to pay people salaries, and you need to compute, and so on. So we also do a certain amount of product work. So we also build like AI products that are not pushing the state of the art, because we consider that to potentially be dangerous, but use the kind of creativity and also technology that already exists to make useful applications. So we're kind of like iterating through like lots and lots of different ideas, kind of really quickly, like doing sprints and like finding things, there. If people I hope people will be interested in trying our various products once they hit the market and see if they're any good or not.
Could you give us any hints on what you're developing? So
currently, we're developing a useful meeting notes tool, just a simple transcription tool that can also like summarize, allows you to like do speaker detection stuff.
Oh, similar to what I'm doing.
Yes,
yeah, very similar.
Very similar. We're not sure if this is going to be our forever tool. We're sprinting on trying a bunch of different tools. And actually, funny, the first tool we built. So it was very funny. We had this great vision for this really cool, complex writing assistant tool, and we built it, and then we found it was just way too complicated for users. And we're like, damn, like people just don't understand this tool. It's too complicated.
Yeah.
So we kind of like pivot away from that. And we have a bunch of other ideas of things we're going there. But ultimately, what we really care about is we think that, AGI is coming soon. Very powerful systems that are coming. We need to really advance our theory, our understanding, our ability to align these systems. So we do a lot of like interpretability work, like mechanistic interpretability work. We do a bunch of other work. I am very soon, probably by the time this podcast comes out, it'll be open. I will have published my personal research agenda, which has been secret for quite a while. But I want to publish it so other people can like critique it and like comment on it. So hopefully by the time this podcast is out, you can go give it a look and tell me I'm crazy. It's been a wild ride. And we also do a lot of work on trying to work on coordination and working with other people to basically just, at heart, I want other people to see that this problem is real. It is a technical problem. It is not it was very funny. I was in Brussels talking to politicians, and one of them kind of like sneeringly noticed that I was like on one of these like AGI people, like, oh, so you believe in this like singularity thing, huh? And now I was like, I think whether singularity exists or not is a purely technical question about reality, and it's independent of my personal philosophical or religious beliefs. And he was like, good point. And that's kind of the message I try to push to people, is that these questions are fundamentally scientific in nature. There is also hard philosophical questions, but whether these problems exist, whether AGI is possible, whether, alignment is hard or not, are like mostly technical questions. And I think, I want to also kind of push to people that I think alignment is the kind of problem that does not get solved by default. Like there are, in most worlds, if you don't try, it just doesn't get solved. And you just keep building stronger and stronger systems, which like slowly, drift away from what humans actually want. And then eventually just something weird happens, and then we're suddenly stuck in some world which we don't like. And there's no way out. It doesn't have to be that all people even die. I mean, probably, but like it could also just be we get stuck in some kind of like, corporate, advertisement hellscape forever, and just we can't escape because all the governments are run by AI now, and we're just stuck. That's also a possible outcome.
So building software products is really difficult. It requires a different culture, a different mindset, different types of people, lots of challenges and so on. And it feels basically orthogonal to the alignment work that you're doing. And so now you have to hire different types of people, divide your effort and resources and so on. How do you wrestle with that?
It is a very hard problem. It's been less hard in practice than I expected it to be. So I this is the original sin of conjecture. The original sin is that we have to divide our attention to a certain degree, but we're just like pragmatic about it. I talked earlier about how I've become more tolerant of tension, and the word tension was like specifically chosen because this is a great example of tension. This is like cognitive dissonance. There's tension here, and at first I tried to bend over backwards to remove this tension, but now I'm just like, oh no, there is a tension here, and I'm just going to accept that. Like this is just a cost I'm willing to pay. Of course, if some benevolent billionaire watching the show would like to just shower us with sufficient funds that we can just focus fully on our research and don't have to focus on product, please give me a call. But I don't expect us to live in that world. I expect us to live in a world where if you need billions, say, to do cutting edge research and to hire enough researchers and to do lobbying and like who knows what else is necessary, right? Whatever is necessary to solve this problem, then VC and like products and like in this coming AI tsunami that I expect is just the most effective way to raise the necessary resource. In a way, it's a form of instrumental convergence.
Yes.
I have undergone instrumental convergence in the sense that I don't care about money for its own sake. I care about improving people's lives and making people happy and like all these things. But instrumentally, to achieve those goals, you need money, you need friends, you need influence, you need power. You need to do these things. And so I just do those. It's not because I enjoy them. It's just part of the job.
Interesting. Because I want to unpick a little bit from investors care about returns.
Yep.
And they will see that you have, my co-founders, it really pisses them off that I do so much stuff on MLST. They think I'm obsessed with MLST. And I think that it's hugely beneficial for our business as well. And I know it will go somewhere interesting. I know it's enriching and it's magical in lots of different ways. And I would imagine you have the same thought about the alignment work, that even though they seem orthogonal, actually they're not.
Oh, of course. Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, it's the ultimate problem. It is the best problem. It is the thing that needs to be solved. You solve alignment, you solve everything. You get you good end. You shake hands, GG, well played. We did it, boys. You can build everything. Once we get AGI, if we solve alignment, you get everything. You can build everything. You can build all of the most valuable products. You can cure all diseases. You can bring world peace. Have everyone negotiate superhumanly well and like be friends with each other. You can achieve. Every product will ultimately be bottlenecked. Every goal you want to achieve will be bottlenecked by control once intelligence and power is no longer the limiting factor. Currently, our systems are still limited by their power and their intelligence. But more and more, the bottleneck is going to be our ability to control them. And we expect, and we are currently observing, in our opinion, that people are vastly underestimating this bottleneck. And that this bottleneck might be so critical that, it causes catastrophe if it is unresolved. But also, if you just want value, and ultimately we want value, right? We want not just like, value in the abstract sense, but in the practical sense of like things that people like and things that make people happy. Sure, if you develop a drug that cures cancer, that will make you a lot of money, but also it cures cancer. That's fucking great. Like, nice, awesome. So for that, you need to solve the alignment problem. And so, it's just kind of in a world, I think, where people maybe had had more of the like autistic, straightforwardness that I do. I think a lot of people would just fund that and wouldn't need the short-term returns. But I'm practical, and that I'm just like understand that that's just not how the world works. It's actually a really interesting thing. This is another thing I learned about last year, is that the biggest bottleneck on doing great things, to my surprise, is often trust. And it sounds so banal. Like when I first thought about this, or when I was first told this by a friend of mine, I thought it was like, we're bottlenecked by resources or intelligence or like whatever. But more and more, I realized that like, no, man, it's so hard to get like people to truly actually trust each other and not get scammed.
Yeah.
Like if you can find a way to like 100% like check that someone's not a scammer and you can trust them completely, like imagine what would be possible. This is actually one of my schizo things. If I wasn't working on AI, if I thought AI was further away and I wanted to save the world, I would probably work on mind reading technology. And the reason I would do that is because it would allow you to coordinate. You could check for liars, and then you could just have perfect honesty, and you could have trustworthy collaborations that cannot be broken. Of course, in practice, that would probably lead to dystopia. So I wouldn't actually probably build this. But It is a fun sci-fi vision to think about, where everyone, when they think of mind reading, you first think of dystopia, but then also imagine you can have your politicians be checked that they never lie to their constituents. And you can check that if someone signs a contract, that they will never break the contract. And you can like enforce this. If you could do this, man, the level of coordination, the level of like trust you could build in an efficient organization, in an efficient group, an efficient society, I think you could get a lot out of that. Probably not actually possible, but it's funny to think about.
Yeah, and ironically, another form of alignment. But yeah, trust makes the world go round. Even when I invite guests onto MLST, they'll say yes if they trust that I'll give them a good interview. So we have, we have a concept of status in our mind and who we trust, and a lot of it actually is a theory of mind. It's we predict how other people will behave in certain situations.
Yep, absolutely correct.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so can you speak to specifically the work that you've been doing?
I cannot speak to the work specifically that I personally have been doing at this time, unfortunately.
You can't at all?
Nope. Sorry.
Anything that you've published?
I've talked about 6 other people who are not me have published at the company.
Okay.
I personally have not published very much.
Okay.
We have, I think the most interesting work scientifically is the interpretability work we've done. So we have a number of posts, which I'm not going to go into the details now, but are worth reading, where we've just been doing lots of interesting experiments trying to like iterate on trying to understand language models, how they work internally, neural networks and stuff. Mostly small things. We're just kind of like been working very quickly, trying many things. There is also so this is something I think a lot of people won't recognize as something very valuable, but I think is super exciting, which is, so we're a very weird company. For one, we have an epistemology team, which is a very weird thing for a startup to have.
About that. And
everyone thinks we're crazy for this. And I keep telling them, no. Like this is where I spend my crazy points on. Because like we cut on epistemology earlier today, but I think epistemology, doing it right, is actually the most powerful like meta skill you can have. Of course, most people just don't do it right. Like in my opinion, if you were good at good philosophy should make you stronger. Mm-hmm. Being a great philosopher should make you better at everything. You should be better at your job. You should be better at your relationships. You should be better at understanding science. You should be better at everything. Of course, unfortunately, that's not how most philosophy is done. It's actually really sad that I feel like a lot of people don't even expect philosophy should be useful. I don't know how it got to this point, but for me, if you're the greatest philosopher to ever live, you should be good at everything. You should be a complete polymath genius. But that's unfortunately not how things really are in practice.
Does that mean that you have hired knowledge engineers?
In a way, yes.
What do they do?
That's a great question. And they do some things I can't talk about, some things that will be published. So they've done some things that are pretty, standard philosophy stuff, like trying to understand how science is done. In the past, how was science done? How can these be applied to alignment? Why is alignment hard? There's a pretty good post that Adam Sheemy, who's the head of our epistemology team, wrote called Epistemological Vigilance for Alignment, where he talks about I had a hand in that post as well. And we talked a lot about why is alignment particularly difficult? Like, why is it different from physics? So a lot of people look at physics and they see physics as like high status science. And like, well, oh, look, we solved quantum physics. So like, surely like we can solve any problem. But like, no, quantum physics is actually a very easy problem, epistemologically speaking, compared to many other problems. Like, there's so many ways in which physics is kind of like the easiest science. Like, you have like these like repeatable experiments you can do. You have lots of data. You have like these like simplified systems. You have like, you just like ignore second order correlations, like all these reasons that don't apply to like harder. So like what are really hard sciences are things like predict the stock market. That's hard because it's adversarial. Like, you interacting with the system makes it resist you. That is very hard to study. And we do not have good epistemology of how to study adversarial systems or chaotic systems. Chaotic systems are kind of like a more general class of adversarial systems. Adversarials are like a particularly bad system in this regard. And I expect, for example, AGI to be, in a sense, adversarial and chaotic and various other properties. So that's a lot of stuff they've been doing. They also are writing a sequence of posts, which I think are really, really great. And I really recommend people. They're very short. I really recommend we call them building blocks, which is just like one page each, kind of explaining a very simple like philosophical idea or like a very simple like piece of advice or a very simple like idea of like how to think better or like optimize better. The long-term goal is, I've said earlier that like being an optimizer is an unnatural thing for a human to be. Like, most people are not optimizers. And that's really bad because we need optimizers to actually solve hard problems. Like, you know, if you want to be the best at science and you want to solve the hardest problem, you have to be an optimizer, you know? And I think a lot of it can be taught, actually. I think learning to be an optimizer is a thing you can learn. I've learned much more how to be an optimizer than I have in the past. I'm much better at just like accomplishing arbitrary goals, which is an interesting state to be in. And the building block series has a bunch of like our like distilled things that we found that have like helped us improve this and like raise the sanity waterline, like help people make more reasonable epistemological decisions and thinking. They're also working on some other stuff that I can't currently talk about. But yeah, it's very weird. It's a big bet. And like a lot of people think I'm crazy for doing it, but you know, we'll see.
Fascinating. I think I did read the blog post about the interpretability on the language model, and I don't want to trivialize it in any way, but it was something along the lines of, what if it is an AGI and we don't know? Is that a fair summarization?
We don't have a single post about that specifically. We have a few posts of like talking about various topics. I'm not sure exactly which one you're talking about. You might be talking about. I'm not sure exactly which one you're talking about.
Oh, maybe I'm misremembering, but I think it was something along the lines of, what if it's deceiving us?
Oh, yes. That's the How to Defeat Mind Readers.
Right, okay.
Yeah. Lee wrote that post. That's one of the posts that one of our researchers has written. We've written a whole bunch of these. But
okay.
And yeah, that's an interesting one where it's like, you know, how could a system that is trying to trick us? And there's a lot of ways. There's many, many ways they can trick us. So that was more of a brainstorming post.
Okay.
We've also done some technical work. We've had like on like polytopes. We have one on the SVD directions are very interpretable in transformer models. A few other posts like this. Most of them are quite short. They're like less than a paper. They're like we focused more on like producing small, interesting posts and like optimizing more for like small, interesting pieces of information rather than trying to like produce massive papers that take 6 months to write. And we're getting much faster at that too.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like more the direction of like where the interpretability is currently heading. Of course, the long-term vision is to develop much better interpretability theories and tools and methods.
Yeah, because that's a great example. You know, we were talking earlier about that creative insight, and most people would not think for a second that, let's say GPT. I mean, you said when we spoke last time, we had dinner out, and you know there was that refrigerator token.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the characters in the simulation become self-aware that they're in a simulation, or in the case that you just spoke about, maybe something like GPT-3 is actually trying to deceive us, and it's the nature of it is actually different to what we think it is, and that's something that most people just wouldn't have the imagination to come up with that.
Yep. It's very true. This is another classic in the alignment world, is that it's kind of like futurist whack-a-mole, where the usual way this happens is the futurist says, "Hey, I think AGI could do some like crazy things, and like things we can't understand or predict." And then the interlocutor will be like, well, okay, name one thing. And then they name a thing. And like, oh no, that's actually irrelevant because actually that can be fixed using this. And then like, well, yeah, sure. But what about, scenario 2? And like, oh, okay, yeah. But like, we could have done this other thing to solve that. But then, and then the futurist at some point is like, don't you see the problem? You didn't think of 1 or 2 before I pointed it out to you. Yeah, but I could fix it once you pointed it out. Like, no. The generalized form of this is that a sufficiently intelligent system will come up with even more things that neither you nor me can come up with.
Yeah.
This is it's very funny how often I've run into this exact scenario where I like give people, like people ask me for a scenario and I'm like, fine, here's the scenario. And they're like, oh, okay. And well, I'm not worried anymore because I could fix that one. And then they don't generalize to the general case of like, okay, but you didn't come up with it either. So what are all the other things you're not coming up with? If you're dealing with a system that is smarter than you should just expect it can trick you. Even if you can't come up with how it can trick you, you should just assume there is something it can do that can trick you.
Yeah, amazing. Connor, this has been great. What are your plans for Christmas and the New Year?
Heading home to my family. I haven't seen them in a long time because I'm going to spend some time in Germany, and then I'm going to come back to London with my German friends in Tau, and we're going to celebrate New Year's here. So really looking forward to that. Amazing.
Connor Leahy, it's been an absolute honor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Tim.
Cool.